Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
One summer, I took a job as a temporary groundskeeper for a large botanical garden. It was a dream job, lush greenery, exotic flowers, and the calm solitude of nature. Most of the groundskeeping crew worked during the day, but my shift started at 3 p.m. and went until 11 p.m. The idea was to clean up after visitors and prepare the garden for the next day. The botanical garden sprawled over acres, and some sections were rarely visited, even during peak hours. One such area was the stone pathway, an older, lesser maintained part of the garden featuring a windy trail through overgrown shrubs and crumbling stone steps. One evening, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, I was assigned to clean up the stone pathway. It wasn't my favorite place, it always seemed colder there, and the thick canopy above made it darker than the rest of the garden. But the job was simple: clear fallen branches, pick up trash, and report any damage. I was halfway through the trail when I saw it. A single garden glove was lying in the middle of the path. It wasn't unusual for visitors to drop things, so I picked it up, intending to place it in the lost and found later. But as I continued down the path, I found another glove, a different one, then a scarf, then a child's sandal. They were spaced just far enough apart to seem deliberately placed, leading me further down the path. At this point, the sun was gone and the path was cloaked in shadow. The garden's automated lights hadn't turned on yet, so I used my flashlight to navigate. As I followed the scattered trail of belongings, my unease grew. Each item looked slightly older, dirtier, and more weathered than the last. Finally, I reached a small clearing where the path ended. In the middle of the clearing was a wooden bench, and sitting on it was a figure. They were hunched over, their back to me, and their head down. I could tell from their silhouette that they were clutching something in their lap. My first thought was that he was a homeless person who had somehow wandered into the garden after hours, but as I shone my flashlight on them, they didn't react. "Excuse me," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "The garden is closed. You need to leave." No response. I stepped closer, my flashlight trained on them. "Sir," they have them. Still nothing. I was about 10 feet away when I noticed the smell. It was faint but distinct, like damp earth and decaying leaves. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, but my feet were rooted to the ground. Finally, the figure moved, not to turn toward me or stand up, but to lift their hands, revealing the object in their lap. It was a small, rusted trowel, and then they spoke, but their voice was hollow, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. "Did you bring it back?" I had no idea what they were talking about. "Hi, I don't know what you mean." They turned their head slightly, just enough for me to see the side of their face. Pale, too pale. The texture of their skin reminded me of dried out clay. Their eyes, if you could call them that, were sunken hollows. "Did you bring it back?" they repeated, more insistent this time. I dropped everything, the gloves, the flashlight, even my radio, and ran. I don't think I stopped until I was back at the visitor center, gasping for breath. When I told my supervisor what had happened, he looked at me with a strange mix of concern and resignation. "You went to the stone pathway?" he asked quietly. I nodded. He sighed. "We don't send staff there at night." "Didn't anyone tell you?" "No one had." I quit the next day. A few months passed after I left the job, but I couldn't shake the memory of that night. The stone pathway stayed in my dreams, twisting and turning like a maze, always ending at that same clearing with the figure on the bench. Sometimes, in the dream, they would turn fully toward me, and I'd wake up drenched in sweat before I could see their face. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to look up the botanical garden's history. If my former supervisor knew something he wasn't saying, maybe the answer was out there. It didn't take long to find some interesting tidbits buried in local forums and old newspaper archives. Apparently, the stone pathway was one of the oldest parts of the garden, built decades before the rest of the grounds. Originally, it had been part of a private estate belonging to a family named the Driscolls. The house had burned down in the early 1900s, and the land was sold to the city. The Driscoll family had been known for their eccentricities, particularly the youngest daughter, Eleanor. She had a habit of wandering the grounds alone, often leaving small belongings behind as markers to find her way back. But the story took a darker turn. One night, Eleanor didn't return to the house. They found her body near what would later become the clearing on the stone pathway. The official cause of death was listed as exposure, but there were rumors, talk of something more sinister. Some believed she had been lured into the woods by someone or something she thought she could trust. The unsettling part, the belongings scattered along the path that night matched those described in old police reports: gloves, scarves, and a single child's sandal. They were items Eleanor had been carrying when she disappeared. I told myself it was just coincidence. Maybe the items I found were a prank left by some overzealous visitor who knew the story. But deep down, I couldn't convince myself it was that simple. There had been something too deliberate, too eerie about the way they were laid out. A few weeks later, I received a package in the mail. It didn't have a return address, just my name scrawled scrawled in shaky handwriting. I opened it, and my stomach dropped. Inside was the flashlight I had abandoned that night on the stone pathway, but it wasn't the same as I remembered. It was rusted, as if it had been left outside for years, and the beam didn't work anymore. There was also a single piece of paper folded neatly in half. On it, written in the same shaky handwriting as the address, were 3 words: "Did you bring it?" I moved cities the following week, refusing to give anyone at the garden my forwarding address. To this day, I don't know how they found me or who they even are. If you ever visit a botanical garden and see a path that feels just a little too quiet, a little too forgotten, please, for the love of everything, don't follow it. And if you find any gloves, scarves, or sandals along the way, don't pick them up. For months after I moved, I avoided any mention of the botanical garden. I deleted old contacts from my time there, ignored emails, and even stopped gardening in my new backyard. But it didn't matter how far I ran or how much I tried to push it away, the stone pathway had wormed its way into my mind. The dreams grew worse. They weren't just about the figure on the bench anymore. Now, I'd see myself walking the path, hearing faint footsteps behind me. When I'd turn around, no one was there. Sometimes, in the dream, I'd try to leave, only to find that the path never ended. It just stretched on forever, growing darker and colder with each step. One night, I woke up to find muddy footprints leading from my bedroom window to the foot of my bed. My heart froze. The window had been locked, and there was no sign of forced entry, yet the footprints were unmistakable, small and barefoot, like those of a child. They led right up to my bed, then stopped. I spent that night at a motel. The next day, I went online and reached out to a paranormal investigator. Desperate times called for desperate measures. A woman named Clara responded to my post. She claimed to have experience with residual hauntings and what she called place-bound entities. I didn't care if it sounded ridiculous, I needed answers. Clara visited my house a few days later. She was younger than I expected, in her early 30s, with an air of quiet confidence. She carried a bag filled with tools I didn't recognize, candles, strange-looking crystals, and a notebook with symbols scribbled all over it. After I explained everything, she sat silently for a long moment, then nodded. "You didn't just encounter something," she said. "You took part in it, whether you meant to or not." I didn't understand what she meant, but she insisted on performing a cleansing ritual in my home. She burned sage, whispered chants in a language I didn't know, and placed salt in every corner of the house. It helped. For a while, the dream stopped, and I started to feel like I could finally breathe again. But then, one evening, Clara called me, her voice urgent. "I've been doing research on the Driscoll family," she said. "Elena wasn't the only one who disappeared. There were 3 others over the years: gardeners, a visitor, and even a security guard. All of them were last seen near the stone pathway." My stomach turned as she continued. "There's a theory that Elena wasn't lured there. She was doing the luring, and I tried to protest, to tell her she must be mistaken, but deep down, I knew she wasn't. The figure on the bench, the belongings on the path, the whisper asking, 'Did you bring it?' It all made a twisted kind of sense. And then she dropped the bombshell. 'You left something behind, didn't you?' My heart sank. The flashlight, that's her way of tethering you," Clara said. "She uses what you leave to keep you connected. You have to go back. You have to take it and destroy it." I wanted to hang up, to ignore her and pretend it was over, but I couldn't. I knew Clara was right. The dreams, the footprints, the package, it wasn't going to stop until I faced it. So, against every instinct in my body, I made plans to return to the garden. The night I went back, the air was heavy with the promise of rain. The garden had closed hours earlier, but Clara had arranged for us to sneak in. She came with me, though I could tell she was nervous. We made our way to the stone pathway, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. When we reached the clearing, it was exactly as I remembered it. The bench, the oppressive silence, the feeling that we weren't alone. The figure wasn't there, but my rusted flashlight lay on the ground where I had dropped it months ago. It looked even more decayed than before, almost unrecognizable. Clara lit a candle and handed it to me. "Pick it up," she said softly, "and don't let go, no matter what." I hesitated, but finally bent down and grabbed the flashlight. The second my hand touched it, the temperature plummeted, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees. Shadows danced around us, and I swear I heard faint whispers, like dozens of voices speaking at once. Clara began chanting, louder and faster. The whispers grew into cries, angry and desperate, but I held onto the flashlight, clutching it like a lifeline. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was the same as before, hunched over, clutching that rusted trowel. But this time, it stood up. It started moving toward us. "Now!" Clara screamed. "Destroy it." I threw the flashlight onto the ground, and Clara poured salt and some kind of oil over it before setting it ablaze. The fire flared unnaturally bright, and the figure let out an ear-piercing shriek before vanishing into the darkness. The clearing fell silent. We didn't stick around. Clara and I ran back to the visitor center, neither of us daring to look back. Since that night, the dreams have stopped. My house feels like my own again, and I haven't seen any more footprints. Clara told me she thinks it's over, that a leader's tether to me has been severed. I want to believe her. This happened about 5 years ago when I was visiting a small town in New England. It was one of those picturesque places with cobblestone streets and old brick buildings. I had the day to myself and decided to do some window shopping. That's how I stumbled upon a tiny antique shop tucked between a bakery and a flower shop. The shop had no sign, just a small bell over the door and a display of old clocks and watches in the window. Inside, the place smelled of dust and aged wood. Every surface was cluttered with knickknacks, faded photographs, and oddities I couldn't quite place. The only other person there was the shopkeeper, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a voice that was almost too cheerful. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but a large grandfather clock in the back corner caught my eye. It was beautifully carved, with intricate details of stars and swirling clouds etched into the wood. It wasn't ticking, which seemed odd for a clock in such good condition. When I asked the shopkeeper about it, her smile wavered slightly. "Oh, that one," she said, her tone a little too light. "It's a display piece. Doesn't work." Something about the way she said it made me uneasy, but I shrugged it off. I spent another 15 minutes browsing before I decided to leave. Just as I was heading out the door, she called after me, "Don't touch the clock." I stopped and turned. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her eyes were wide, and her face was pale. "I mean it," she said, her voice low now. "Don't go near it." I laughed awkwardly and nodded, trying to shake off the weirdness. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the clock. I told myself it was just my curiosity, but deep down, I knew it was something more. The way the shopkeeper had looked at me, it was almost like she was scared for me. The next morning, I went back to the shop. The bell over the door jingled, but the shop was empty. It felt colder than it had the day before, and the air was heavier, like a storm was brewing. I walked straight to the grandfather clock. Up close, I could see more of the details, tiny faces etched into the wood, their mouths open in silent screams. My stomach churned. Why hadn't I noticed that before? I reached out to touch the clock, half expecting the shopkeeper to come rushing in, but no one stopped me. The moment my fingers brushed the wood, the room grew impossibly still. All the faint sounds of the street outside vanished. My hand jerked back as a chill ran up my spine. That's when I noticed the clock's pendulum. It was moving now, slowly at first, then faster. The hands of the clock, which had been frozen at 12:03, started spinning wildly. Then I heard it, a soft whisper so faint I almost thought I was imagining it. But the whisper grew louder, a cacophony of overlapping voices, all saying the same thing. "Leave." I stumbled back, knocking into a shelf. A glass figurine crashed to the floor, shattering. The noise broke whatever trance I was in, and I bolted out of the shop without looking back. I never went back to that antique shop. In fact, I left the town entirely that same day. A week later, I tried to find it online, hoping to make sense of what had happened. But there was no record of it, no listing, no photos, nothing. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or why the shopkeeper was so insistent that I stay away from the clock. All I know is that I'll never forget the way those tiny faces looked, frozen in silent terror. I thought that would be the end of it, just a strange memory I'd carry with me for the rest of my life. But a few weeks later, I started noticing something. It began with small things. My bedroom clock stopped ticking one night, even though I had just replaced the batteries. Then my watch stopped too. I figured it was just bad luck, but the unease lingered. One morning, I woke up to find all the clocks in my house, wall clocks, digital clocks, even the clock on my oven, stuck at the same time. 12:03. My stomach dropped. I hadn't thought about the grandfather clock in days, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a coincidence. I threw away every clock in my house that same day, convinced that getting rid of them would solve the problem. It didn't. That night, I woke up to the sound of ticking. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls. I searched my entire house, tearing through drawers and cabinets, but there was nothing, just that relentless ticking. When I tried to ignore it and go back to bed, I had a vivid dream, or maybe it wasn't a dream at all. I was standing in the antique shop, staring at the grandfather clock. The hands were spinning again, faster and faster, and I could hear those whispers. This time, they weren't telling me to leave. They were saying my name. The next morning, I called my best friend, Emily, and told her everything. She tried to reassure me, saying it was probably stress or an overactive imagination, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. I asked her to stay over that night, just in case. Around midnight, the ticking started again. Emily heard it too, and for a moment, I felt a twisted kind of relief. At least I wasn't losing my mind. We followed the sound to my living room, but there was nothing there, just the empty space where my wall clock used to hang. Then Emily froze. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing to the corner of the room. At first, I didn't, but then I noticed a shadow, darker than the rest of the room, standing perfectly still. It wasn't cast by anything, it was just there, and in the center of the shadow, I saw the faint outline of a clock face. "Get out," I whispered to Emily, my voice shaking. We ran out of the house and didn't stop until we were halfway down the street. The ticking had followed us, growing louder and louder until we couldn't hear anything else. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. That was the last night I stayed in that house. I packed packed up and moved in with Emily the next day. I didn't tell her, but when I was unpacking my suitcase, I found something that wasn't mine, a small, carved wooden figure of a clock with tiny, screaming faces etched into it. I buried it in the backyard and never looked back. Even now, I sometimes hear fate ticking when I'm alone. It's never loud, never insistent, just a reminder that whatever followed me from that antique shop is still there, watching and waiting. I tried to settle into my life at Emily's place, convincing myself that burying the wooden figure had severed whatever connection I had to that cursed clock. For a while, things seemed normal. The ticking stopped, the nightmares faded, and I started to believe I was free of it. Until last week. It started with Emily's cat, Milo. He'd always been a sweet, lazy creature, but one night, he started acting strangely. He wouldn't go near my room, hissing and arching his back whenever I tried to coax him in. Then, I began waking up to find him sitting outside my door, staring at it with unblinking eyes. Emily brushed it off, saying cats were weird like that, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling it gave me. The night after Milo's behavior started, I woke up to a sound I hadn't heard in months. To him, it was faint at first, like it was coming from far away, but as I lay there, frozen in my bed, it grew louder and louder until it felt like it was right next to my ear. I tried to turn on the lamp beside my bed, but the bulb flickered and died. That's when I saw it. At the foot of my bed, a shadow began to form. It wasn't cast by anything, it was just there, growing darker and more defined. Within the shadow, I could see the outline of a clock face, its hands spinning so fast they blurred. The whisper started again, the same overlapping voices from the antique shop, but this time they weren't saying my name. They were laughing. I scrambled out of bed, fumbling for my phone. The screen lit up, but the time was frozen at 12:03. Panic surged through me as the ticking grew deafening, drowning out even my own ragged breathing. I don't remember running out of the room, but I found myself in Emily's hallway, pounding on her door. She opened it, her face pale and confused, and I threw myself into her arms, sobbing. "What's wrong?" she asked, but I couldn't find the words to explain. All I could say was, "It's here." The next day, I decided to do something I'd been avoiding since this whole thing started. I called a priest. I wasn't particularly religious, but I figured if anyone could help, it would be someone with experience in, well, unexplainable phenomena. The priest, Father Michaels, listened patiently as I told him everything. He didn't laugh or dismiss me, which was both comforting and unsettling. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "This isn't the first time I've heard of something like this," he said. "Objects like that clock can act as anchors for things, spirits, entities, whatever you want to call them. They latch onto people, feeding off their fear. If you've already buried the wooden figure, that's a good start, but it might not be enough." He suggested a cleansing ritual, both for me and for Emily's apartment. I agreed, desperate for anything that might help. The ritual itself was uneventful, but that night, I had another dream or vision. I was back in the antique shop, standing in front of the grandfather clock. This time, the shopkeeper was there, her face gaunt and tired. "I told you not to touch it," she said, her voice echoing in the stillness. "It's too late now." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "How do I stop it?" She shook her head. "You don't stop it. You survive it." When I woke up, I found a new object on my nightstand, a small wooden clock, identical to the one I had buried. Its hands were frozen at 12:03. Now, I'm writing this from a motel room in another state. I've changed my number, quit my job, and cut ties with almost everyone I know. Emily doesn't understand why I left so abruptly, and I can't bring myself to tell her. I don't want her getting dragged into this any more than she already has. The ticking follows me everywhere now. It's always faint, just on the edge of hearing, but it's there. The whispers come and go, too, their laughter more taunting than ever. I've stopped sleeping, afraid of what I'll see if I close my eyes. To anyone reading this, if you ever come across an antique shop with no sign and a beautiful, intricate grandfather clock in the back corner, don't go inside. Don't touch the clock. Don't even look at it for too long. This happened a few years ago when I was traveling through a small, picturesque town in Europe. It wasn't my original destination, but a train delay left me with an unexpected layover. The town was charming, the kind of place that felt untouched by time. Cobbled streets, colorful buildings, and an unusual number of chapels, some grand, some barely more than a single room. I spent the afternoon wandering around, snapping photos, and browsing the local shops. By evening, the streets began to empty out. A soft mist rolled in, making everything look even more like a postcard, though it muffled the sounds around me in an unsettling way. As I strolled back toward the small inn where I was staying, I noticed a ribbon tied to a lamppost. It was bright red, standing out vividly against the gray evening. It was tied neatly in a bow, fluttering slightly in the breeze. Something about it seemed deliberate, but also out of place. I looked around but didn't see anyone nearby. I passed another lamppost a few steps later, and it too had a red ribbon. Save me, bow. My heart gave a nervous flutter. It wasn't like these were decorations left from a festival. The ribbons were too fresh, too clean. I decided decided to pick up my pace. The street curved slightly, and as I turned the corner, I spotted a small chapel at the end of the road. It hadn't been there when I walked through earlier, or at least, I didn't remember seeing it. There was nothing remarkable about it, plain stone walls, a wooden door, and a small bell tower, except, of course, for the red ribbon tied to the iron gate at its entrance. The mist was thicker now, and the street lights seemed dimmer. A strange, muffled ringing came from the chapel, like bells being struck with something soft. I felt an overwhelming urge to go back to the inn, but curiosity, stupid curiosity, pulled me forward. The gate was slightly ajar, the ribbon fluttering invitingly. I pushed it open just enough to slip through and stepped into the small courtyard. The muffled ringing continued, rhythmic and deliberate. My heart was pounding, and every instinct was screaming at me to turn around, but I kept walking toward the chapel door. It was slightly open, just a crack, enough for me to see the dim glow of candlelight inside. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet night. No answer, just the continued ringing. I nudged the door open wider and stepped inside. The interior was small, with rows of wooden pews and a simple altar at the front. Candles lined the walls, their flames flickering in a way that didn't seem entirely natural. The air was thick with the scent of wax and something else I couldn't place, something metallic, like blood. And then I saw it. At the front of the chapel, where the altar should have been, there was a figure. It was cloaked in black, its face obscured by a hood. In its hands, it held a small bell, which it rang slowly and deliberately. But the sound wasn't coming from the bell, it was coming from somewhere deeper, somewhere I couldn't see. The figure stopped ringing the bell and turned toward me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and cold. My legs finally caught up with my brain, and I turned and bolted out of the chapel, not caring how much noise I made. As I ran back to the gate, I noticed that all the red ribbons were gone. The lampposts were bare. The mist was gone too, leaving the street eerily clear. I didn't stop running until I reached the inn, where I locked my door and spent the night staring at the window, waiting for something or someone to appear. The next morning, I tried to find the chapel again, thinking maybe I could convince myself it was a dream or some overactive imagination fueled by exhaustion. But the street where I'd seen it was just an empty alley, no chapel, no ribbons, nothing. As I boarded the train that afternoon, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something or someone was watching me. I found a seat by the window, facing the direction the train would travel, and settled in, trying to put distance between myself and the strange events of the night before. The train began to move, and the picturesque countryside blurred into rolling hills and dense forests. I tried to focus on the scenery, but my mind kept drifting back to the red ribbons, the chapel, and that hooded figure. About an hour into the journey, I noticed something odd. Among the green of the trees and fields, there was a flash of red. It was faint at first, but as the train passed through a wooded area, I began to see more of them. Red ribbons tied to tree branches, flapping in the breeze. My stomach twisted. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some local custom or decoration for an event. Maybe it had nothing to do with what I saw last night. But as the ribbons became more frequent, I knew that wasn't the case. They were tied in the same neat bow, the same vivid red. I turned to the passenger sitting across the aisle, an older man reading a newspaper. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you see those red ribbons out there?" He glanced out the window, his face blank. "Ribbons? No, I don't see anything." I forced a nervous laugh. "Never mind. Must be my eyes playing tricks on me." He nodded, uninterested, and went back to his paper. I stared out the window again, heart pounding. The ribbons were still there, now tied to fences and road signs along the tracks. The train slowed as we approached a small station. I hadn't paid attention to the schedule, but this didn't look like a planned stop. There was no sign of a platform, just an overgrown clearing with a weathered bench and an old signpost leaning precariously. And there it was again, a red ribbon tied to the signpost. The train stopped completely, the engine hissing as the doors slid open. No one got off, and no one got on. The conductor's voice came over the intercom, announcing a brief delay due to a signaling issue. I felt a chill run down my spine. I had to get out of there. Something about the ribbons felt deliberate, like they were guiding me or trapping me. I looked around, hoping to find some reassurance in the faces of the other passengers, but no one seemed concerned. Most were reading or scrolling through their phones. Then I saw her. A woman stood on the platform, or what passed for one. She was tall and thin, her long dark hair blowing in the wind. She wore a white dress, but what caught my attention was the red ribbon around her neck. She was staring directly at me. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but her expression was pleading, desperate. I pressed my hand to the glass, a reflex I couldn't explain, and as I did, she raised her hand in return, pointing toward the train car door. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. She kept pointing, her eyes wide with urgency. The train jolted slightly, and the doors began to close. Relief washed over me as the woman stepped back, disappearing into the trees. The train started moving again, leaving the ribbons and the strange stop behind. The rest of the ride was uneventful, but the woman's face stayed with me. Her pleading expression, the way her mouth moved, was she trying to warn me? Or was she trying to lure me out? When I finally reached my destination, destination, I told myself I'd leave all of it behind. I'd forget the ribbons, the chapel, the hooded figure, and the woman on the platform. But as I settled into my hotel that night, I pulled out my camera, curious to see the photos I'd taken in the picturesque town. As I scrolled through the images, my breath caught. There, in the background of several photos, was the same woman, always distant, always watching. It's been years since that trip, but the unease has never fully left me. Life moved on, but every so often, something reminds me of that strange town. A flash of red out of the corner of my eye, the sound of faint bells carried on the wind, a fleeting, unshakable sense that someone is watching. For a long time, I convinced myself it was all in my head. The ribbons, the chapel, the woman, they were just figments of an exhausted mind or some local folklore I didn't understand. But then, a few months ago, I received a package in the mail. It was unmarked, with no return address, and arrived at my apartment in the city. I assumed it was a mistake, something meant for a neighbor, but when I opened it, my blood ran cold. Inside was a single red ribbon, neatly tied in a bow. I stared at it, my hands shaking, trying to make sense of it. Who could have sent this? How did they know where I lived? There was no note, no explanation, just the ribbon. I threw it in the trash and tried to forget about it, but sleep didn't come easily that night. The next day, I found the ribbon again. It was on my kitchen counter, the bow just as perfect as before. I had no explanation for how it got there, and that's what terrified me the most. My apartment was locked, with no sign of forced entry. I grabbed it, stuffed it into a drawer, and left for work, desperate to get out of the house. When I came home that evening, the ribbon was gone. In its place was something new, a small, silver bell, sitting in the middle of my dining table. It was polished to a shine, the kind of bell you might see on an old hotel counter. There was no ribbon, no note, just the bell. I didn't touch it. I didn't even step into the room. I backed out, locked the door, and spent the night at a friend's house, too afraid to be alone. The next morning, I called the police. They checked the apartment and found nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of a break-in, no fingerprints. The bell was gone too, as if it had never been there. Since then, the occurrences have been sporadic but undeniable. A red ribbon tied to my doorknob 1 week, faint ringing sounds outside my window another. I've moved twice, changed my phone number, even left social media, but it doesn't seem to matter. The ribbons always find me. The most recent incident was the worst. I was walking home late after a night out with friends. The streets were quiet, the kind of stillness that presses on your chest. As I turned a corner, I saw them, red ribbons tied to every lamppost lining the street. My heart sank. I stopped in my tracks, looking around for anyone, anything that could explain this. That's when I heard it, the soft, rhythmic ringing of a bell. It was faint at first, but it grew louder with every passing second. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, and that only made it worse. It felt like it was all around me, echoing off the walls of the buildings. I started running, my footsteps pounding against the pavement, but no matter how far I went, the sound followed. When I finally reached my apartment, I slammed the door behind me, locked it, and collapsed on the floor, gasping for air. The ringing had stopped, but my heart was still racing. I stayed awake all night, too scared to sleep. The next morning, I found something new. On my coffee table was a photograph. It was of the chapel, the same one I'd seen all those years ago. The image was faded, almost antique looking, but the red ribbon tied to the iron gate was unmistakable, and standing in front of the gate was the hooded figure. I don't know how this ends. I don't know what they want from me, or why they won't leave me alone. All I know is that it's only a matter of time before they make their next move. This happened when I was in college, working as a part-time assistant at a historic opera house in my city. It was one of those old, ornate buildings with velvet curtains, golden accents, and a heavy air of grandeur. Most of my job consisted of mundane tasks, helping with tours, ushering during events, and occasionally running errands for the managers. But one day, I was asked to clean and organize the Fete room. The Fete room was an oddity, even by the opera house's standards. It was a small, tucked-away space near the upper balcony, said to be where Victorian women would go to recover when their corsets became too tight. I passed it before but never paid much attention. It was always locked, and I assumed it was just a storage room now. But my manager handed me a key and said they were thinking of reopening it for private tours, so it needed a deep clean. I wasn't thrilled about the task. Dust and spiderwebs weren't my thing, but I figured it was an easy way to kill a few hours. I grabbed a cleaning kit and made my way up to the Fete room. The key slid into the lock with a surprising smoothness, considering how old it was. When I opened the door, the first thing that hit me was the smell. It wasn't musty as I'd expected, but faintly floral, like dried roses. The room was small and oval-shaped, with a chaise lounge in the center, an antique vanity against one wall, and heavy curtains over a single window. I started dusting the vanity, and that's when I noticed the mirror. It wasn't cracked or discolored like most old mirrors. It was pristine, almost too clean. The reflection was sharp, but it gave me a strange feeling, like it was showing the room slightly wrong. I can't explain it, but it felt like the reflection was just a second out of sync with reality. I shook off the unease and moved moved to the chaise lounge. It was covered in a sheet, and when I pulled it off, a small cloud of dust rose into the air. That's when I saw something that made my stomach drop. Carved into the wood frame of the lounge, right near where someone's head would rest, were the words, "Don't sit here." It looked old, like it had been scratched into the wood decades ago. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of joke from a past employee, but it felt rugged. I snapped a picture of it with my phone, figuring I'd show my manager later, and moved on to the curtains. When I pulled them back, the floral smell grew stronger. I looked out the window and realized something was off. From this angle, I should have been able to see the street below, but all I saw was an expanse of black. Not nighttime darkness, just nothing. I stared at it for a long moment, feeling my pulse quicken before deciding I'd had enough. I gathered my supplies and turned to leave, but as I reached for the door, I heard a soft creak behind me. I froze, my hand on the doorknob, and slowly, I turned back toward the chaise lounge. Someone was sitting there. It was a woman dressed in a Victorian gown, her face obscured by a veil. She was leaning forward, her gloved hands clasped tightly together as if she was sobbing silently, but there was no sound, just the faint smell of roses growing stronger and stronger. I blinked, and she was gone. I didn't waste any time. I threw open the door and ran down the stairs, leaving the cleaning supplies behind. When I told my manager what happened, they gave me a strange look and said, "You're not the first person to say something like that about that room." Needless to say, I quit the job a few weeks later. I don't know what I saw or what was in that room, but I hope I never have to find out. For weeks after I left the job at the Opera House, I couldn't shake the experience. The fainty room haunted my thoughts in a way that nothing else ever had. I'd catch myself staring at mirrors for too long or instinctively holding my breath when I passed by floral perfume counters in stores. But the worst part, the photo. Remember how I mentioned taking a picture of the carved warning on the chaise lounge? It was still on my phone, and for the first few days, I was too scared to look at it, but curiosity finally got the better of me. Late one night, I opened my gallery and found the image. At first, it looked normal. The carving, "Don't sit here," was clear in the photo, just as I remembered it. But as I zoomed in, I noticed something else. Reflected in the polished wood of the chaise's armrest, there was a faint silhouette. It was small, distorted by the curve of the wood, but it was unmistakably a figure. A woman sitting upright, with her hands clasped together. I stared at the photo until my eyes burned. It was impossible, I told myself. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or a smudge on the surface of the wood. I tried convincing myself of anything that didn't involve what I feared was true, that she had been there even when I didn't see her. In the following days, strange things started happening. It began with the floral scent. I'd smell it out of nowhere, in my bedroom, on the bus, even in my car. It wasn't overpowering, but it lingered like a whisper I couldn't quite catch. Then, the knocking started. It was always the same. 3 soft taps, coming from inside my closet, or at the window, or even, once, from the bathroom mirror. Every time I'd rush to check, there was nothing there, just empty air and the faintest whiff of roses. One night, I woke up to find my phone screen illuminated on my bedside table. The photo of the chaise lounge was open. I didn't remember unlocking my phone, let alone opening the gallery. My heart pounded as I stared at the screen. That's when I noticed the figure in the reflection had moved. She was no longer sitting, she was standing, her veil hanging slightly to one side, and her hand was outstretched, as if reaching toward the camera. I deleted the photo immediately, hoping that would end whatever was happening. It didn't. The following week was a blur of sleepless nights and paranoia. Every shadow seemed to stretch too long, every sound felt too deliberate. I finally decided to contact the Opera House. Maybe, I thought, someone could give me an explanation, or at least reassurance that I wasn't losing my mind. When I called, the manager who answered seemed hesitant to talk. "I'm sorry," they said, "but we can't share too much about that room. There's history there." "What kind of history?" I pressed, my voice shaking. "Look, all I can say is you're not the first person to have issues after working in that room," they admitted. "If you want my advice, just let it go. Don't try to figure it out." I hung up feeling more unsettled than ever, but their words stayed with me. Let it go. Don't try to figure it out. So I didn't. I moved out of my apartment a month later, changed my number, and cut ties with anyone connected to the Opera House. The floral scent stopped following me, and the knocking disappeared. For the first time in weeks, I began to feel normal again, but every now and then, I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a faint outline in the reflection of a window, or a shadow that seems too still. And for a split second, I smell roses. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. I had almost convinced myself that the entire ordeal was the result of stress stress or some bizarre, overly vivid imagination. But as much as I tried to forget, there was always a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, a subtle fear that the Faty room wasn't done with me. The final incident happened about a year after I left the opera house. I had moved to a new city and started a fresh chapter of my life. My new apartment was small but cozy, and I was beginning to feel safe again. One night, after a long day at work, I decided to treat myself to some tea and a good book. The world outside was quiet, the kind of peaceful silence that made the air feel heavier. I was halfway through my tea when my phone buzzed. It was strange because I had muted notifications for the night. When I picked it up, there was a single, unread message from an unknown number. The text was short but immediately froze me in place. "Did you forget about me?" My heart dropped. My first thought was that it had to be a prank, some random wrong number. But as I stared at the message, something about it felt too personal, too deliberate. I hesitated before typing back, my hands trembling. "Who is this?" I said. The reply came almost instantly. "You left me in the room." I dropped the phone as if it had burned me. My breathing was shallow, my skin cold with sweat. I didn't want to look at the screen again, but I couldn't stop myself. When I picked it up, there was a third message waiting. "Come back." I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I spent hours frantically searching the internet for any information I could find about the fainting room. Old articles, forums, even urban legends, anything that might explain what had happened. Most of it was the same, stories about strange noises, phantom smells, and unsettling reflections. But one story caught my eye. It was a thread on an obscure paranormal website, written by someone who claimed to be a former custodian at the opera house. They described the fainting room in eerie detail, including the chaise lounge and the mirror. But it was the last part of their post that made my blood run cold. "Whatever you do, don't sit on the chaise. Don't look into the mirror for too long. And if you hear her speak, never answer. Once she knows your name, she'll never stop looking for you." I slammed my laptop shut. By they, I had signed the messages with my name. The next week was pure hell. The floral scent returned, stronger than ever. They clung to my clothes, my sheets, even my skin. Shadows moved in places they shouldn't, and the soft knocking started again, this time at every window, no matter where I was. Then came the voice. It started as a whisper, so faint I thought I was imagining it. A soft, lilting tone that seemed to drift from the walls. "Why did you leave me?" It would ask, over and over. "Come back." One night, I woke up to find my bedroom bathed in the dim glow of my phone's screen. It was on the floor, the same photo of the chaise lounge open again. Only now, the reflection was clearer than ever. She was there, fully visible, her veil pulled back. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken but piercing, as if she was staring directly at me through the screen. I screamed and threw the phone across the room, shattering the screen. The smell of roses became suffocating, filling every corner of the apartment. And then, for the first time, I heard her voice clearly, right behind me. "Don't you want to see me again?" I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew, it was morning and I was lying on the floor, the shattered phone still beside me. I packed up and left that same day. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not friends, not family. I cut every tie and moved across the country, leaving everything behind. For now, things have been quiet. The scent is gone, the knocking has stopped, and I've managed to rebuild a semblance of a normal life. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll catch a whisper in the wind, soft and mournful, calling my name. And every now and then, the faint smell of roses drifts through the air, just for a moment. I work as a freelance graphic designer, and I'm obsessed with stationery, pens, paper, you name it. There's this little stationery store a few blocks from my apartment that carries a lot of niche supplies, so I often go there to restock or just browse. The owner, an older man named Victor, knows me by name and always greets me warmly when I walk in. One quiet Wednesday afternoon, I stopped by the store to pick up some calligraphy ink. Victor wasn't at the counter, which was odd, but I figured he might be in the back room organizing inventory. There was only one other person in the store, a man in his late 40s or early 50s, dressed in a rumpled suit that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. His hair was unkempt, and he was standing unnervingly close to one of the display shelves, muttering to himself under his breath. I tried to ignore him as I browsed, but something about him made me uneasy. His muttering wasn't coherent, just fragments of sentences like they'll see. Both them not yet, not yet. I'm a naturally curious person, but this wasn't something I wanted to investigate further. I quickly grabbed the ink I needed and headed toward the counter, hoping Victor would appear so I wouldn't have to interact with the stranger. As I approached the register, the man suddenly turned and stared directly at me. His eyes were wide and glassy, and he had this unnerving half smile on his face. He didn't say anything, just stood there watching me. I pretended not to notice and set my items on the counter. Still no sign of Victor. "Need help finding anything?" I asked, just to break the silence. I know, I regretted it immediately. The man's smile grew wider. "I've already found what I need," he said, his voice low and almost sing-song. "But thank you." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded and looked around, hoping Victor would magically appear. The store was completely silent, except for the faint buzzing of a fluorescent light above me. Finally, I decided to just leave the money for my ink on the counter and get out of there. As I reached into my bag to grab my wallet, I heard the man's footsteps behind me. "Do you know how this place works?" he asked, his voice closer than I expected. I turned around, and he was standing only a few feet away, holding what looked like a fountain pen in his hand. "You think it's just a store, don't you?" he continued. "But it's not. Not really." "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I think I'm just going to leave now." I backed toward the door, but he followed me, his smile never wavering. "You can't leave yet," he said. "Not until you know. They don't like it when people leave without knowing." At this point, I was thoroughly freaked out. I grabbed the door handle and yanked it open, fully expecting him to try and stop me. But he didn't. He just stood there, watching me with that eerie smile as I stepped out onto the sidewalk. As the door swung shut behind me, I heard him say, "See you next time." I practically ran home and didn't look back. Later that evening, I called the store to make sure Victor was okay. He picked up on the second ring, and when I asked about the man, he sounded confused. "What man?" he said. "You were the only customer I had all day." A week passed after the incident, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe Victor had just been mistaken or distracted when I called, but his reaction replayed in my head like a broken record. I found myself double-checking locks, glancing over my shoulder, and avoiding the store entirely. But no matter how much I tried to forget, the man's words, "You think it's just a store, don't you? But it's not," kept resurfacing. One night, while working late on a project, my phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from an unknown address, the subject line blank. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The body of the email was short. "Didn't figure it out yet. Time's running out." Attached was a photo of the stationery store, taken at night. The lights inside were on, casting an eerie glow onto the sidewalk. And there, standing at the window, was the man from that day, staring directly into the camera with that same unsettling smile. I froze. How did this person know my email? And why was he contacting me? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank, someone messing with me. But the logical part of my brain couldn't explain how the photo looked like it had been taken just moments ago. I glanced at the clock on my laptop. 1:12 a.m. My apartment was quiet, the streets outside even quieter. Every instinct screamed at me to ignore it, to delete the email and go to bed. But instead, I did the one thing I swore I wouldn't. I went back to the store. The walk there felt like a nightmare, my heart pounding in rhythm with my footsteps. The streets were deserted, the only sound the occasional hum of a distant car. When I turned the corner and saw the store, I stopped dead in my tracks. The lights were on, just like in the photo, but the place was supposed to be closed. Victor never stayed open this late. I considered walking away, but something pulled me forward. Curiosity, maybe, or some strange compulsion I couldn't explain. As I approached the storefront, I noticed the display shelves had been rearranged. Everything was in disarray, pens and notebooks scattered like someone had gone through them in a frenzy. And there, in the center of the chaos, was the same fountain pen the man had been holding. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the tiny bell above it jingling weakly. "Victor," I called, my voice trembling. The store was silent. No footsteps, no rustling from the back room, nothing. I took a cautious step forward, and then another. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive. As I reached for the counter, a faint whisper echoed through the space. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again, clear this time. "Not yet, not yet." It was him. I whipped around, expecting to see the man standing behind me, but the store was empty. My eyes darted to the back room door, which was slightly ajar. Against my better judgment, I crept toward it, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The whispers grew louder as I pushed the door open. Inside, the room was bathed in a faint, otherworldly glow. Victor's desk was covered in papers and strange symbols I didn't recognize. On the wall, someone had scrawled words in red ink, or was it something else? They watched through the cracks. Then I saw it, a small, ancient-looking mirror propped against the wall. Its surface rippled like water, and the man's face appeared, staring at me from the other side. His grin widened as he spoke. "Nagdasit." I bolted out of there, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I was back in my apartment, locking every door and window. That night, I didn't sleep. The mirror's image burned into my mind. The store was boarded up the next day. No explanation, no sign of Victor, and the email, it vanished from my inbox, leaving no trace. I've tried to move on, but sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers coming from my living room. I refuse to look, but I can feel it, the same heavy presence I felt in that back room. I don't know what I saw that night, but one thing is clear, I should have never gone back. I tried everything to distance myself from what happened. Therapy, meditation, even moving to a new apartment on the other side of the city. But no matter where I went, the memories followed me. Worse, the whispers didn't stop. At first, they were faint, like the echo of a dream, but over the weeks, they grew louder, more insistent, always at the edge of my hearing. And the worst part, I started seeing the man. It wasn't like he was standing outside my window or following me down the street. No, it was more subtle than that. I'd catch glimpses of it in reflections, shop windows, car mirrors, even the blank screen of my phone. Always the same unnerving smile, always staring, as if he was waiting for something. The final straw came one night when I was brushing my teeth. I leaned down to rinse my mouth, and when I looked up, he was there in the bathroom mirror. But this time, he wasn't smiling. His expression was one of anger or maybe frustration. His lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear. I stumbled backward, knocking over the toothbrush holder and nearly slipping on the tile floor. When I dared to look again, he was gone. The mirror reflected only me, pale and trembling. That night, I didn't sleep. The next morning, I called a friend, Sarah, who's always been the rational one in our group. I told her everything. She didn't laugh or dismiss me like I thought she might. Instead, she listened intently, her brow furrowed. This sounds, I don't know, like something out of a bad horror movie, she said. But if it's real, maybe it's connected to that store. Have you tried going back? Are you kidding me? I nearly shouted. Why would I go back to that place? Sarah shrugged. Because it might be the only way to end this. If he's tied to the store, or whatever you saw in that back room, then maybe facing it is the answer. I hated how much sense that made. The thought of stepping foot in that store again made my skin crawl, but I couldn't keep living like this. The whispers, the sightings, it was too much. So, after a lot of convincing, I agreed. Sarah insisted on coming with me, which gave me a shred of comfort. When we arrived, the store was still boarded up, but the boards looked hastily nailed in place, like someone was more concerned with keeping people out than securing the building. A for-lease sign hung crookedly in the window, but the glow inside was still faintly visible through the cracks. This is it, Sarah asked, peering through the gaps. Doesn't look so scary. Wait until you go inside, I muttered, using a crowbar Sarah had brought. Don't ask me why she owns one. We pried the boards loose and slipped inside. The air was stale, the smell of ink and paper replaced by something metallic and sour. The store was just as I remembered, the scattered supplies, the strange symbols on the walls. But the back room door was gone. What the? I whispered, running my hand over the wall where the door had been. It was seamless, as if the back room had never existed. Sarah frowned but didn't say anything, her flashlight scanning the room. Then we heard it, the whispering. Both of us froze as the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just random muttering this time. It was a voice, low and gravelly, repeating a single phrase. You shouldn't have come back. Sarah, we need to leave, I said, my voice shaking. But before she could respond, the air around us seemed to shift. The light from Sarah's flashlight flickered, and the shelves began to shake violently, pens and notebooks tumbling to the floor. A deep, guttural laugh echoed through the space. And then he appeared. The man stepped out of the shadows, his eyes gleaming with a sickening light. His smile was wider than ever, stretching impossibly across his face. He raised a hand, and the air grew colder, heavier. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Sarah grabbed my arm and screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the man's laughter. You think you could live, he said, his voice reverberating through the store. You're part of this now. I don't know how we managed to escape. 1 second we were frozen in place, and the next, we were running out the door, the man's laughter following us into the street. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, Sarah turned to me, her face pale. Never again, she said. I don't care what happens. I've done it. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. I knew she was right. Whatever that place was, whatever I had seen, it wasn't something I could fight or fix. Since that night, the whispers have stopped, and I haven't seen the man again. But every so often, I dream of the store, of its glowing lights in that doorless back room. And in those dreams, I hear his voice, whispering from the darkness, he'll be back. They always come back. I've always loved museums. There's something about the quiet reverence of a place that holds so much history and knowledge. But after what happened last year, I don't know if I can ever step into one again. It started with an invitation to a private tour of a newly discovered section of an old art museum in my city. The gallery had been sealed off for decades, left forgotten behind a wall during renovations in the 1920s. When construction workers accidentally uncovered it, they found it untouched, a perfect time capsule. The museum had invited a select group of members, including me, to see it before it open to the public. The gallery was called the Whispery Wing, and no one could explain the name. It was filled with portraits, mostly of people who were local figures in the 19th century. The curator, a tall woman with a calm but commanding voice, led us through the collection, her flashlight beam dancing over gilded frames and aged faces. These portraits are unique, she said, and unlike many traditional pieces, these were commissioned by individuals of lesser social status. There are no records of the artists, only the subjects. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the paintings. The eyes eyes seemed too lifelike, almost as if they were following us. I told myself it was a trick of the lighting, but I couldn't stop glancing back at them. Halfway through the tour, I noticed something odd. The room wasn't entirely silent. Faint murmurs seemed to drift through the air, just on the edge of perception. I strained to hear, but every time I tried to focus, the whispers faded. Does anyone else hear that? I asked, breaking the curator's monologue. She paused, her expression unreadable. The gallery is known for its acoustics, she said. Sound carries strangely here. No one else in the group seemed concerned, so I let it go. But as we moved deeper into the wing, the whispers grew louder. They were still indistinct, but now they seemed to form words. Leave, one voice hissed. I froze, my heart hammering. I glanced around, but no one else seemed to hear it. As we reached the final room, the whispers grew into a cacophony, though still only I seemed to notice. The room held the largest portrait of all, a woman in a black dress, her face pale and severe. Her eyes seemed sharper than the others, almost alive. The moment I stepped into the room, the whispers stopped. The silence was so sudden it felt like I'd gone deaf. Then, the curator spoke. Legend says this is the last portrait ever painted in the gallery. The subject was unusual. She insisted the artist paint her exactly as she appeared, with no embellishments. Shortly after it was completed, she disappeared. I stared at the painting, and the air felt heavy, oppressive. The woman's gaze was locked on mine, and I couldn't look away. Then, her lips twitched. It was so slight I almost doubted I'd seen it, but I felt it. She smiled, and I stumbled backward, knocking into one of the other guests. They glared at me, but I didn't care. I turned to leave, but the exit wasn't where I remembered it. The gallery seemed to shift, the walls narrowing, the path twisting. I ran, my footsteps echoing louder and louder until they didn't sound like mine anymore. I wasn't alone. A shadow stretched along the walls, too long to be cast by the others in the group. And the whispers, they were screaming now, their words blending into a chaotic roar. Finally, I burst into the main hall, gasping for air. The others filed out behind me, calm and composed, as if nothing had happened. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but no one believed me. I haven't been back to the museum since, but sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear the whispers again. They're faint, almost like a memory. Since that night, I've tried to move on, but the experience lingers, wrapping itself around my thoughts like a fog. The whispers that followed me out of the museum haven't stopped entirely. At first, they were faint, only audible in the quietest moments, just as I drifted to sleep or while walking alone at night. Over time, they grew more persistent. I thought maybe it was stress, a trick of my mind, trying to process the fear I felt that night, but then I started noticing small, unsettling details. Objects in my apartment would shift slightly when I wasn't looking. A chair that I knew I pushed in would be pulled out. Doors I'd locked would creak open in the middle of the night. The worst was the mirror in my bathroom. I began to avoid it, sensing that something wasn't right. One night, as I brushed my teeth, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. A figure, a pale face with dark, hollow eyes, stood just behind me. My heart stopped, and I spun around, but no one was there. The whispers became clear after that, and their words weren't comforting. They warned me. They talked to me. She's watching. They said, she'll find you. I didn't know who she was at first, but I couldn't stop thinking about the portrait. The woman in black with that cold, knowing smile. I looked her up, hoping to find some explanation, but the museum's website had no record of the Whispery Wing or its collection. When I called to ask, the receptionist sounded confused. There's no gallery by that name, she said. Are you sure you have the right museum? I hung up, shaken. I knew what I'd seen. I still had the invitation, the ticket stub, but it was as if the gallery and that night had been erased. The situation escalated last week. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a strange noise, a soft tapping at my window. My apartment is on the 5th floor, and there's no fire escape or balcony. My stomach sank as I crept toward the window, heart pounding. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. When I pulled back the curtain, the street below was empty, but pressed against the glass, faint but unmistakable, was the outline of a handprint. It was small and delicate, as if left by a woman's hand. I barely slept that night, and in the morning, I packed a bag and left to stay with a friend. That no matter where I go, the whispers follow. They're louder now, almost constant, and I can feel her presence growing stronger. It's like she's closing in. Last night, I dreamt of the gallery again. The walls were tighter, the shadows deeper. The woman in the portrait was waiting for me, her smile wider now, her eyes filled with a cruel, predatory glee. I told you to leave, she said, her voice blending with the whispers. But you didn't. When I woke up, there was something on my nightstand that hadn't been there before, a small, gilded picture frame. It was empty, but I swear I could feel the edges hum beneath my fingers, like it was alive. I don't know how much longer I could take this. The whispers are louder than ever, and I've started seeing her in the corners of my vision, just for a moment before she disappears. She's not just in my dreams anymore. She's to anyone reading this, if you're ever invited to a private tour of a forgotten gallery or a mysterious museum wing, don't go. No matter how tempting it sounds, no matter how exclusive the invitation, don't do it. I wish I could say that writing this down has made me feel better, better, but it hasn't. If anything, it feels like she knows I'm talking about her. The whispers are louder tonight, overlapping and urgent, as though they're fighting to be heard over each other. She's coming. I've tried to ignore them. I've tried to stay rational, but my attempts to brush this off as paranoia or stress have failed. There's something real happening to me, and I can't explain it. Every light in my apartment is on, but the shadows still seem to creep closer, pulling in corners and under doors. A few hours ago, I decided I couldn't stay here any longer. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, but the moment I touched the handle, the whisper stopped. Completely. It was the most unsettling silence I've ever experienced. My ears rang from the absence of sound, and then I heard her. "Leaving won't help," she said, and her voice was soft but cold, like wind slipping through a crack in a window. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My legs buckled, and I collapsed against the door, my breath shallowed and panicked. She was right. Leaving wouldn't help. I don't know how I know that, but I do. It's like she's tied to me now, like I've somehow invited her into my life. Running won't change anything. She'll follow me, no matter where I go. After that, I tried calling a friend. I didn't want to be alone, but when I dialed their number, all I heard was static. The same happened with every number I tried, even emergency services. It was as if the world outside my apartment had disappeared. I've spent the last few hours sitting in the middle of my living room, trying to convince myself that this is all in my head, but it's not. I can feel her here with me. The air feels heavy, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The empty picture frame she left on my nightstand, it's no longer empty. When I glanced at it earlier, I saw something new, a faint, shadowy outline of a figure. I didn't dare pick it up, but as I stared at it, the figure seemed to grow clearer. It's her. I know it's her. She's getting closer. A few minutes ago, I noticed something else. The walls of my apartment are they're not solid anymore. The paint is peeling away, revealing something beneath it. It looks like old wood paneling, the same kind I saw in the whispery wing. I can hear footsteps now, soft and deliberate. They're coming from the hallway outside my door. I don't know how she's doing it, but she's here. She's here, and I don't know how to stop her. If you're reading this, please don't ignore my warning. Don't go looking for the whispery wing. Don't try to learn more about the woman in the portrait. I don't know what she is, but she's not human. She's not something you can understand or escape from. The footsteps have stopped. There's a shadow under the door, and it's not moving. I think she's waiting for me to open it. The whispers have started again, louder than ever, and now they're all saying the same thing. Let her in. I won't. I can't. But I'm not sure how much longer I can hold out. If I don't make it through this, please remember my story. A few years ago, my friend Kayla and I decided to attend a classical music concert at an old, historic concert hall in our city. It wasn't a grand event or anything, just a local symphony performing lesser-known pieces. The concert hall itself was charming but a little eerie, tall ceilings, dim lighting, and heavy wooden doors that creaked when you opened them. We got there early to grab good seats, and as we settled in, I noticed something unusual. Across the aisle and a few rows down, a man sat alone. He was wearing a dark suit that looked almost vintage, with a crisp white shirt and a tie that seemed just slightly off-kilter, like it wasn't tied quite right. He sat ramrod straight, staring at the stage even though there was nothing happening yet. It wasn't that he was doing anything outwardly creepy, but there was something off about it. His stillness was unnerving, and the way he didn't even glance at the people around him or fidget like everyone else made him seem like he didn't quite belong. I figured he was just an eccentric music lover and let it go. The concert began, and for the first half of the program, I forgot about him entirely. The music was beautiful, and Kayla and I were completely absorbed. During intermission, we went to the lobby to stretch our legs and grab a drink. When we returned to our seats, I noticed that the man was no longer in his. The second half of the concert started, and that's when things got weird. About 10 minutes into the performance, I got this overwhelming feeling of being watched. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't ignore the sensation. It was like a weight pressing on the back of my neck. I glanced over at Kayla to see if she was feeling the same, but she was engrossed in the music. Then I looked around the audience, trying to spot the source of my discomfort, and froze. The man in the suit was now seated directly behind us in the otherwise empty row. I hadn't heard him move. I hadn't even noticed him re-enter the hall. My stomach churned, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he just wanted a better view of the stage. For the rest of the concert, I couldn't focus. I was hyper aware of every sound, every shift in his seat, every breath he took. At one point, I swear I felt him lean forward, just slightly, like he was trying to get closer to us. I gripped Kayla's arm as subtly as I could and whispered, "Don't look," but the guy behind us moved seats. Kayla furrowed her brow and whispered back, "What guy?" That's when my heart dropped. She hadn't noticed him at all. hall. When the concert ended, we stayed in our seats to let the crowd thin out. I didn't want to risk bumping into him in the aisle, but when I finally glanced behind us, he was gone. No coat, no program, no sign he'd ever been there. I tried to laugh it off on the way home, convincing myself that maybe he'd just slipped out early. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The memory of his unwavering stare and silent movements kept replaying in my mind. A few days later, I was scrolling through local forums when I stumbled upon a post about the concert hall. It was filled with stories of strange occurrences, phantom footsteps, cold drafts in the middle of summer, and a man in a dark suit who always seemed to be watching. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. My chest tightened as I scrolled through comment after comment about the man in the suit. The descriptions were eerily similar to what I'd experienced: vintage attire, an unnatural stillness, and, most unsettlingly, the way he seemed to appear and disappear without a trace. One commenter shared a chilling detail. They claimed the man was often spotted sitting in random places throughout the hall, but when approached, he would vanish. Another mentioned hearing whispers and feeling a sudden chill whenever they were seated near him. One post stood out to me. The user had uploaded an old black and white photo of a symphony audience from the 1920s, taken in the very same concert hall. My stomach flipped when I spotted him, seated near the back of the crowd, in a suit identical to the one I'd seen. It wasn't just a resemblance, it was him. The comments below the photo speculated that he might have been a musician, a patron, or even someone who died in the hall long ago. I slammed my laptop shut, feeling a rush of cold air, even though my apartment was warm. I wanted to tell Kayla about what I'd found, but I couldn't bring myself to call her. What would I even say? Hey, remember that guy we saw? Turns out he's probably a ghost. For weeks after that, I avoided the concert hall. I didn't even want to walk past it in case I caught sight of him through one of the tall, arched windows. Kayla teased me about how spooked I was, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. She even joked about going back to see if we could meet him again. No thanks, I said flatly. Once was enough. Months later, Kayla texted me out of the blue. She'd gone back to the concert hall with her boyfriend for another performance. Her message was short, but it made my blood run cold. He was there again. Same suit, same stare. This time, he was sitting next to me. I don't think I'll ever go back. I haven't set foot in that concert hall since. I don't know who or what that man is, but I do know one thing. If you ever find yourself at the old concert hall and spot a man in a vintage suit sitting silently, don't stick around. After Kayla's text, I spent the rest of the day in a fog of unease. I wanted to call her to get every detail of what had happened, but something stopped me. Part of me didn't want to hear it. What if hearing her story made it all feel too real? That night, I barely slept. I kept imagining the man in the suit, his stillness, his unblinking stare, and the way he could subtly appear where you least expected him. It was as if my mind was trying to piece together his presence to make sense of something that wasn't supposed to exist. A few days later, Kayla finally called me. Her voice was shaky, and I could tell she was trying to keep calm, but I could hear the fear underneath. I didn't want to text you everything, she started, because honestly, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. I listened in silence as she recounted her experience. She and her boyfriend, Matt, had arrived at the concert hall just as the doors opened. They found their seats near the middle of the hall, nothing unusual so far. But as soon as the lights dimmed and the orchestra began tuning, she felt it, that same heavy, oppressive feeling of being watched. I turned around, and he was there, she said, sitting 3 rows behind us, staring at me. He wasn't looking at the stage, not at anyone else, just me. Her boyfriend hadn't noticed anything, brushing it off as her imagination. But Kayla couldn't shake the feeling. Throughout the first half of the concert, she kept sneaking glances behind her, and every time, he was in the exact same position. His eyes locked on her. At intermission, they went to the lobby. Kayla told Matt about the man, but when they looked back toward their seats, the man was gone. We thought maybe he left, she said, but when we got back to our seats, he was there, sitting next to mine. I felt a chill run down my spine. What did Matt say? He didn't see it. Kayla whispered. The guy was sitting right there, but when I pointed him out, Matt looked at me like I was crazy. He said no one was sitting next to us. She tried to ignore it, focusing on the music instead, but the presence next to her was overwhelming. She could feel the man's gaze on her, though she didn't dare turn to look. It wasn't until the end of the concert, when the crowd rose to applaud, that she finally turned to face him and found the seat empty. I don't know what he wants, but it feels personal, she said, her voice trembling. It felt like he was trying to make sure I saw him. And Olive, her words stuck with me. I couldn't help but wonder why Kayla, why us? Was it because we'd noticed him before, or was it something deeper? I started digging into the concert hall's history, desperate for answers. What I found made my skin crawl. The man in the suit wasn't wasn't just a random spirit. There were scattered accounts dating back decades, all describing encounters with a figure just like him. But the most unsettling detail, in nearly every story, the man wasn't just watching, he was waiting. Some claimed he only appeared to those who were alone. Others said he targeted people who noticed him in previous visits, almost as if he was drawn to their attention. And in a handful of cases, people reported seeing him in other places, far from the concert hall, as if he'd followed them. Kayla and I agreed to avoid the concert hall for good, but every now and then, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the faces in a crowd, half expecting to see him again. This happened a few years ago, back when I was still working odd jobs while finishing school. One of those gigs was at an old electronics repair shop. It was one of those places that seemed like it belonged to another era, filled with shelves of dusty, obsolete gadgets and stacks of manuals with crumbly pages. The owner, Mr. Elwood, was a quiet but kind older man who had run the place for decades. He could fix almost anything, but his specialty was antique radios. One day, a man came in with an old tabletop radio. It looked like it was from the 1930s, wooden casing, fabric grill, the works. The man didn't say much. He placed the radio on the counter, slid a scrap of paper with his contact info across to me, and simply said, "It doesn't work. Can you fix it?" Mr. Elwood was thrilled to take on the project. He loved these old radios and said this model, in particular, was rare. As he worked on it over the next week, I noticed something unusual. Normally, he'd hum or talk to himself while working, but with this radio, he was silent. Sometimes, I'd glance over and see him just staring at it, his brow furrowed. Finally, he got it working, but when he turned it on, instead of the usual static or music from whatever station it could still pick up, there was just whispering, quiet, incomprehensible, but constant. Mr. Elwood adjusted the dials, but no matter what frequency he tuned to, the whispering remained. Weird interference, he muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. He powered it off, saying he'd run a few more tests the next day. That night, I was closing up the shop. Mr. Elwood had left early, so I was alone. As I was locking the front door, I heard the radio turn on in the back room. My stomach dropped. I was sure I turned it off. Cautiously, I walked to the back. The radio was glowing faintly, its dials turning on their own. The whispering was louder now. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was frantic, like someone trying to warn me about something. Then, just as I reached for the plug to disconnect it, the whispering stopped. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the radio. And then, clear as day, a woman's voice came through. "Don't let him take it back." I froze. My first thought was to call Mr. Elwood, but when I looked at the clock, I realized it was after midnight. The man who brought the radio hadn't been back yet, and I had no idea when he would return. I left the shop quickly, locking the door behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched as I walked to my car. The next day, when I told Mr. Elwood what happened, he just stared at me. "It's probably an old recording or signal bleed," he said, but his voice wavered. He packed the radio up and put it on a high shelf in the back, saying he wasn't comfortable returning it to the customer until he figured out what was going on. A week passed, then two. The man who dropped off the radio never came back. His phone number was disconnected, and the address he gave didn't exist. Mr. Elwood decided to keep the radio locked in the storeroom until we could figure out what to do with it. One evening, months later, I was passing by the shop after hours and noticed the lights were on. Thinking Mr. Elwood had forgotten to turn them off, I decided to pop in and check. But when I got to the door, I saw someone inside, a man in a dark coat, standing at the counter with the radio in his hands. I watched as he turned and walked toward the back door of the shop. I called out, but he didn't stop or even look my way. By the time I got inside, he was gone, and so was the radio. Mr. Elwood retired not long after that, and the shop closed. I still think about that radio sometimes, especially on quiet nights when I hear faint whispering that I can't quite explain. I tried to forget about the radio and the man, but it was like a splinter lodged in my mind. Every so often, I'd hear static on the radio at home or while driving, and for a fleeting moment, I'd think I caught a whisper just barely audible before fading into silence. A year after the shop closed, I moved to a new city for a fresh start. Things were peaceful for a while, but one night, I was walking home from a late shift when I felt that old, familiar unease creep in. The streets were quiet, too quiet, and every sound seemed amplified. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, and I swore I could hear someone else walking, their steps faint and out of sync with mine. I sped up, my heart racing, and when I turned the corner onto my street, I froze. Sitting on the curb outside my apartment was a radio. Not just any radio, it was the radio. I blinked, convinced I was imagining it, but there it was. The wooden casing, the fabric grill, the worn dial. dials. The air around it felt heavy, like the moment before a thunderstorm. I debated calling the police, but what would I even say? Instead, I walked past it quickly, eyes fixed on my door. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing faint whispers, even though I'd turned off every electronic device in my apartment. I told myself it was my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. The next morning, the radio was gone. There wasn't a trace of it, no scuff marks, no sign it had ever been there. I tried to convince myself it was over, but a few weeks later, the whispers returned. This time, they weren't faint. They were clear. The voice of the woman came again, repeating the same phrase, "Don't let him take it back." Only now, she added something new, "It's too late." From that moment on, strange things started happening. Lights flickered in my apartment even though the wiring was fine. Objects moved to places I hadn't left them. My phone played bursts of static during calls, no matter where I was. And then, the dreams began. In the dreams, I was in the shop again, alone. The radio sat on the counter, glowing faintly. The dials spun wildly, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping until they were deafening. A shadowed figure stood in the corner, watching me. Every time, just as I turned to confront it, I'd wake up, drenched in sweat. I became obsessed with finding answers. I searched for records of the man who had brought the radio in, but there was nothing. No one had ever heard of it. I reached out to Mr. Elwood, but he was evasive, refusing to talk about it. The last thing he said to me before hanging up was, "Don't go looking for it. Just let it be." But I couldn't let it be. A few weeks ago, I got an unmarked package in the mail. Inside was an old photograph of the radio, taken in what looked like a basement. Scrawled on the back in shaky handwriting were the words, "It listens. It learns. Don't turn it on." I've kept the photo locked away, but the whispers haven't stopped. They're louder now, and they don't just come at night. I hear them at work, in my car, even in crowded places. And I've started seeing the shadowed figure from my dreams, always just out of the corner of my eye, disappearing when I turn. I don't know what the radio wanted, or why it chose me, but if you ever come across an old tabletop radio at a thrift store, an estate sale, or even on the side of the road, please, for your own sake, leave it alone. A few nights after I received the photograph, I woke up to a strange sound in my apartment, a faint hum, like the low vibration of an old radio. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and scanned the room. Everything was still and silent, but as soon as I lay back down, the hum started again, growing louder this time. I got up, grabbed my phone for light, and walked toward the living room. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. My breath caught in my throat when I noticed something on my coffee table, the radio. It was impossibly there. The same wooden casing, the same fabric grill, and the dials that glinted faintly in the moonlight filtering through the window. I felt frozen, torn between the instinct to run and the irrational need to destroy it. But then the dials began to move. They spun slowly at first, then faster as if searching for a station. The hum grew louder, morphing into static, and then the whispers began again. This time, I could make out fragments of sentences. "He's watching. ... Don't let it hear you. ... You can't stop it now." The woman's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and desperate. "You need to leave. It's not safe." And then everything stopped. The hum, the whispers, the spinning dials, it all went silent. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the radio until a loud knock at the door shattered the quiet. I jumped, heart racing, and turned toward the door. It was almost 3 a.m. Who would be here at this hour? Another knock came, louder this time. My phone buzzed in my hand, and I glanced down to see an unknown number calling. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Don't open the door," a voice said. It was the woman. The line went dead. I backed away from the door as the knocking grew more insistent, almost frantic. The radio suddenly came to life again, static filling the room. The whispers were louder this time, overlapping voices in a cacophony of warnings and pleas. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the radio and threw it against the wall. It shattered, pieces of wood and circuitry scattering across the floor. The knocking stopped. For a moment, everything was quiet. I collapsed onto the couch, my body trembling with adrenaline. But as I sat there, staring at the broken pieces of the radio, I realized the whispers hadn't stopped completely. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but they were still there, coming from inside the apartment. I turned slowly, and my heart dropped. The shadowed figure from my dreams was standing in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. It didn't move, but I felt its presence pressing down on me, suffocating and cold. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I knew, it was morning, and I was lying on the floor. The radio was gone, and there was no sign of the figure, but the whispers were still there, faint but persistent, following me wherever I went. I've since moved to a new city, changed my name, and cut ties with anyone who might still be connected to that shop. But no matter where I go, I can't escape it. The whispers are always there, growing louder at night, and I still see that shadowed figure in my dreams, or sometimes just out of the corner of my eye. I worked at a corporate office in a major city. Our building had one of those open plazas with fountains and planters, a place where office workers could eat lunch. Underneath the plaza, connected by an unassuming stairwell, was a parking garage that spanned several buildings. I always parked on the lower levels because they were less crowded, even if they were a bit creepy. It was dimly lit, smelled faintly of oil and mildew, and had those long, echoey rows of parking spaces where your footsteps always sound too loud. One evening, I was working late and didn't leave the office until almost 10 p.m. By then, the plaza was deserted, and the garage was eerily quiet. As I made my way to my car, I noticed something odd, a faint sound like humming. It wasn't the typical mechanical hum of the garage lights or ventilation. It was melodic, human. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the acoustics, but as I got closer to my car, the humming grew louder. It was coming from somewhere nearby. I stopped and looked around, my pulse quickening. There were no other cars on my level, no reason for anyone else to be down there. The sound seemed to drift, bouncing off the concrete walls. I couldn't tell if it was in front of me, behind me, or coming from some far off corner. "Hello," I called out, trying to sound more confident than I felt. My voice echoed back at me, but the humming stopped. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding, straining to hear anything. Then, just as I convinced myself it was nothing, the humming started again, closer this time. I bolted from my car. As I unlocked it, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. A figure emerged from behind a pillar about 50 feet away. They were wearing what looked like an oversized coat, the kind you'd see on someone trying to stay warm in freezing weather, but it wasn't cold that night. I didn't wait to get a better look. I dove into my car, slammed the door, and locked it. When I turned the ignition, my headlights lit up the figure. It was a man, his face shadowed by a hood. He wasn't walking toward me, though. He was just standing there, swaying slightly, staring in my direction. I reversed so fast I nearly hit a pillar, then sped out of the garage without looking back. The next day, I reported it to security, but they brushed it off. Probably a homeless person looking for shelter, they said, but it didn't sit right with me. There was something about the way he stood, the strange humming. It didn't feel random. I stopped parking on the lower levels after that and started taking the elevator to my car with other coworkers whenever possible. I never saw the man again, and part of me wonders if he was even real. For weeks after the encounter, I couldn't shake the unease. It wasn't just the man's appearance that haunted me, it was the humming. The melody had stuck in my head, replaying at odd times, like my brain couldn't let it go. It wasn't a tune I recognized, and it didn't have a rhythm that felt natural. It was too fragmented, almost like someone trying to remember a song they'd only half heard before. My coworkers teased me about how jumpy I'd become. I laughed it off, but inside, I felt like something had shifted. I started to notice little things, like how the parking garage always seemed colder than it should be, or how I occasionally heard faint sounds, footsteps or scraping, when I knew no one else was around. One night, I was working late again. Despite my precautions, I was the last one in the office. My car was now parked on the main level of the garage, much closer to the exit. I told myself it was fine. I'd been overly paranoid before. As I walked toward my car, the silence felt oppressive. My footsteps echoed too loudly, the kind of sound that seemed to fill up the space entirely. I didn't hear humming this time, but I felt something, a shift in the air, like I wasn't alone. I quickened my pace, reaching my car in what felt like record time. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the door. That's when I saw it. On my windshield was a smudge, faint but deliberate. It wasn't dirt or a random streak. It was a symbol, something that looked like a circle with 3 intersecting lines. I froze, staring at it. It didn't make sense. I hadn't seen anyone near my car. The garage had cameras, but they didn't cover every angle. I jumped into the car, locked the doors, and drove straight home. When I got there, I scrubbed the windshield clean and told myself it was nothing, probably just some bored kid or an overactive imagination. But then it happened again. A week later, the same smudge appeared on my windshield, this time when my car was parked in broad daylight near a cafe I frequented. It was identical to the first, the same crude symbol. I started carrying pepper spray. I stopped working late and made sure to always leave with a group of coworkers. But the strangest thing was the humming. Even at home, I started hearing it, not often, but enough to notice. Sometimes it came late at night, just outside my window. Other times it seemed to drift through the vents in my apartment building. My friends assured me it was just coincidence, that I was imagining connections where there were none. Then, one night, I woke up to a sound. The humming was inside my apartment. I didn't even think. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the dispatcher that someone had broken in. They stayed on the line with me until officers arrived. When they searched the apartment, they didn't find anyone. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of a break-in. I felt like I was losing my mind. The police left, assuring me they'd patrol the area more often. But as I locked the door behind them, I saw it. On the inside of my living room window, drawn in condensation, was the same symbol. Seeing the symbol on my living room window sent a cold shock through me. I stood there, frozen, my breath fogging up the glass further. It was unmistakable, the circle with 3 intersecting lines signs. But how had it gotten there? The police had just been through my apartment. I hadn't left the window open and the lock was secure. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise in the building made me jump, and I kept my pepper spray clutched in my hand until the sun finally rose. The next day, I called in sick to work and installed security cameras inside my apartment. I bought new locks and even considered breaking my lease to move, but I felt trapped. Wherever I went, the symbol and the humming seemed to follow. For a while, things were quiet. Weeks passed without any strange incidents, and I began to convince myself it had been an elaborate prank or some bizarre coincidence. I even started sleeping better, but then one evening, I came home to find the humming again, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from my bedroom. My stomach dropped. The cameras. I pulled out my phone and checked the footage. At first, everything looked normal. Hours of footage showing an empty apartment. But then, at around 2 a.m. the previous night, the camera in my bedroom captured something that made my blood run cold. The footage showed me sleeping, tossing and turning under the covers. And then, from the corner of the room, the shadows seemed to shift. A figure slowly emerged into the frame, moving unnaturally like a marionette being guided by invisible strings. It was the same oversized coat, the hood obscuring their face. They stood there, motionless, watching me. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The video showed the figure standing there for nearly an hour, never moving closer, never making a sound, before retreating back into the shadows. I couldn't explain how they had gotten in or how they had left. Every door and window had been locked. I called the police again, shaking as I replayed the footage for them. They took it seriously this time, but their investigation led nowhere. No fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. That was the last straw. I packed up and moved out of that apartment within a week, breaking my lease and paying the penalty. I didn't care. I just needed to be somewhere else. It's been a couple of years since then, and I haven't seen the symbol or heard the humming again. I've moved cities, changed jobs, and done everything I can to leave that experience behind me. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I still hear it, faint and distant, as if carried on the wind. A low, melodic hum that sends chills down my spine. I work as an assistant to a small-town real estate agent. Part of my job includes putting together open house packets and mailing marketing materials. One morning, while sorting through the incoming mail, I noticed a peculiar envelope. It was bright pink, the kind you might use for a Valentine's card, with no return address. The strange part, my name was written on it, not my boss's, not the office's, but mine, in looping, almost childlike handwriting. I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly into quarters. On it were just 5 words, scrawled in the same odd handwriting: "Stop looking for the house." I laughed it off at first, thinking it was some kind of prank. Maybe one of my friends was trying to mess with me. I even texted my group chat, but no one admitted to it. Weird, I thought, and tossed the note in the trash. The next week, I received another pink envelope. This time, it was slipped under the office door. It had no postage, so someone must have delivered it by hand. Inside was another note: "I read it. Step." Now I was unnerved. I hadn't been working on any particularly unusual listings. My boss specialized in suburban homes and the occasional fixer-upper, nothing out of the ordinary. Still, I brought the notes to her, hoping she might have some insight. She shrugged them off as a weird coincidence. Maybe a disgruntled neighbor, she suggested. Then came the third envelope. This one appeared on my car windshield while I was grocery shopping. I don't know how they knew which car was mine. My heart sank when I opened it. "You're not listening. Go away." I started to feel paranoid. I hadn't been working on any active searches for homes, just some standard listings. But I couldn't ignore the coincidence anymore. I asked my boss if she had upset anyone recently. She swore she hadn't. That night, I decided to dig through my files to see if I could spot a connection. Maybe an address or a property that might have triggered this bizarre harassment. That's when I found it, a listing from 6 months earlier. It was a foreclosed property we had briefly considered but didn't take on. It was an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, abandoned and falling apart. I remembered my boss mentioning that the property gave her bad vibes, which was unusual for her. She told me to archive it and forget about it. The next morning, I got another note. This time it was taped to my apartment door. I didn't need to open it to know what it said: "Stay away from the farmhouse." I called the police, but without any evidence of a crime or a clear suspect, they couldn't do much. My boss finally agreed to delete the farmhouse from our system entirely, though it hadn't been active for months. The note stopped after that, but I still wonder who or what was so desperate to keep us away from that property, and why they knew so much about me. After the note stopped, I should have felt relieved. For a while, I convinced myself that whoever had been sending sending them had moved on, but deep down, something still nagged at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Months went by without incident. I got back into my usual routine, but I started keeping pepper spray in my bag and always double checking the locks on my doors and windows. I avoided driving near the farmhouse or even thinking about it, until one day I got curious. I don't know what compelled me to search for it again. Maybe it was the unsettling feeling of unfinished business. Maybe it was my own stubborn curiosity. Whatever it was, I found myself pulling the old listing out of the archives one quiet afternoon when my boss was out. The property had been sold to a private buyer shortly after we had turned it down. The buyer's name was redacted in the records, marked only as anonymous. The sale price was shockingly low, even for a foreclosed property in disrepair. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. It was the note in the file. Property sold as is, no inspections permitted. Buyer advised of local legend. That stopped me cold. I hadn't heard of any stories connected to the farmhouse. I did some digging online, trying to figure out what that meant. Most of what I found were vague mentions in old town forums, references to strange lights seen near the property at night, animals going missing in the area, or trespassers claiming to hear whispers when no one was around. And then I stumbled upon something chilling. A blog post written by a former resident of the area described the farmhouse as cursed. According to the writer, anyone who tried to renovate or live on the property would either disappear or leave town suddenly, claiming they couldn't handle it anymore. The most recent attempt had been about 10 years ago, when a couple bought the house intending to flip it. They vanished without a trace. Their car was found a mile away, abandoned and locked. I felt a cold sweat run down my back as I read. That's when I remembered something. The third note, the one left on my car windshield. The handwriting was shaky, but there had been a faint, smudged mark beneath the signature, a tiny circle with a slash through it. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it reminded me of something I'd seen in the blog post. An old symbol locals claimed was meant to ward off whatever lurked at the farmhouse. I wanted to tell myself it was all coincidence, but it felt like too much. That night, I dreamt of the farmhouse. In the dream, I stood at the edge of the overgrown driveway, staring at its dark, broken windows. Something moved inside, a shadow flitted past, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I woke up gasping for air. The next morning, I told myself I'd drop it. No more research, no more dwelling on the farmhouse. But as I drove to work, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A bright pink envelope taped to the front door of the real estate office. I didn't want to open it. My hands were shaking as I carefully peeled it off the door and unfolded the note inside. "We told you to stop. I quit my job the next day." I didn't tell my boss about the note or the farmhouse or anything else. I just left. I moved to another town a few months later, leaving no forwarding address. To this day, I've never gone back to that area or looked up the farmhouse again. Even after moving away, I couldn't escape the lingering paranoia. I started to notice small things that didn't sit right. My mail would occasionally arrive late or appear tampered with, and I'd spot unfamiliar cars parked near my new apartment building at odd hours. At first, I brushed it off as anxiety, but then, one evening, something happened that confirmed my fears. I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a soft tapping sound at my window. I lived on the second floor, so it couldn't have been a stray branch or an animal. My heart raced as I froze, unsure whether I should look or stay out of sight. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Against my better judgment, I crept toward the window and peeked through the edge of the curtain. There was nothing there. No person, no shadow, just the dim glow of the streetlights and the empty parking lot below. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but when I returned to the couch, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an airdrop request. I didn't recognize the sender, and my stomach dropped as I read the file name, Liceo. I declined the request immediately and turned off my phone's Bluetooth. My hands were shaking as I scrambled to check the locks on all the doors and windows. I stayed awake all night, staring at the curtains, jumping at every creak or distant sound. The next morning, I decided it was time to go to the police. I brought everything with me, the pink notes, the blog post I'd printed, even a photo of the airdrop notification. The officer at the desk listened patiently, but I could tell he thought I was overreacting. "You moved out of state," he said. "It's unlikely anyone's following you. This might just be a prank." I left the station feeling more isolated than ever. If the police weren't going to help, what was I supposed to do? I thought about moving again, but I couldn't afford it. Instead, I bought a security camera and installed it outside my apartment. For a few weeks, things seemed quiet. The tapping stopped, the strange cars disappeared, and I started to feel like maybe I'd imagined the worst of it. But then, one morning, I woke up to find a single sheet of paper slipped under my door. It was folded neatly, just like the notes before. I didn't want to open it, but I forced myself to. This one was different. It was typed, not handwritten, and the message was brief. "You shouldn't have moved. You can't outrun this." I checked the security camera footage immediately. The timestamp showed someone in a dark hoodie crouching outside my door at 3:42 a.m. They moved quickly, slipping the paper under the door and disappearing down the hall before I I could make out any features. That was my breaking point. I packed up my things and left that same day, moving to a motel in another town. I told my landlord I had a family emergency and couldn't stay. I didn't even tell my friends where I went. It's been over a year since then. I've changed my phone number, stayed off social media, and moved 3 more times. The notes haven't returned, but the fear lingers. Every knock at the door, every unfamiliar face in a crowd sends my heart racing. Whatever was tied to that farmhouse didn't want me to leave it alone. And even though I've done everything I can to disappear, I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching, waiting for me to slip up. About a year ago, I rented a small art studio in an old brick building downtown. It had high ceilings, tall windows that let in shafts of sunlight during the day, and a faint smell of turpentine and dust. The building had been repurposed from an old textile factory and now housed a mix of artists, writers, and the occasional eccentric hobbyist. It was perfect, or so I thought. I mostly worked in the evenings, painting portraits for a local gallery. My studio was at the end of a long hallway on the 3rd floor. The other studios on my floor were rarely occupied at night, so it was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards. One night, I was packing up around midnight when I noticed something odd. Across the hall, there was a studio with frosted glass doors. Through the glass, I could see the silhouette of a mannequin. Its shape was strange, more angular and sharp than any mannequin I'd seen before. It hadn't been there earlier in the day. Curious but not overly concerned, I left for the night. The next evening, the mannequin was still there. This time, it seemed closer to the door. I tried to peer through the frosted glass to see more detail, but the lights in that studio were off, and the frosted glass only blurred the shape further. By the 3rd night, the mannequin's position had changed again. It now seemed to be facing the door, as if it were staring directly at me through the glass. A chill ran down my spine, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I decided to ask the building manager about it. She looked at me confused. "No one's rented that studio in months," she said. I laughed nervously, assuming she was mistaken. Maybe someone's storing their things there. She shook her head. "I have the only key." The next night, I couldn't resist checking. I brought a flashlight and approached the studio door. My heart was pounding as I peered through the glass again. The mannequin was gone. I felt a wave of relief until I turned around. It was standing in the hallway, mere feet from me. I didn't hear it move. I didn't hear anything at all. Frozen, I stared at it. Its face was blank, its body unnaturally contorted, and its surface had an almost wet sheen, like it was sweating. I bolted. The next day, I went back to the building manager and demanded answers. She reluctantly gave me the key to the studio, probably just to shut me up. I opened the door to find nothing but an empty room. No mannequin, no sign that anyone had been there. The following weeks were a blur of unease. I couldn't shake the image of the mannequin from my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it there in the hallway, its blank, wet face tilted slightly as if studying me. I convinced myself I was just overtired, that the long hours and isolation of painting had played tricks on my mind. But then, things started happening at home. The first incident was subtle, a faint knocking sound at my apartment door late at night. I lived on the 3rd floor of a secure building, and no one I knew would visit unannounced at such an hour. Peering through the peephole revealed nothing but an empty hallway. Still, the sound persisted every few nights, always around 2 a.m. Then I began noticing small objects in my apartment move from where I'd left them. A brush left on my desk would appear on the floor. A mug from the kitchen counter would end up in the sink. At first, I thought I was just forgetful, distracted, but as it kept happening, I knew it wasn't me. One night, I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold, the creak of my bedroom door opening. My heart raced as I stared into the darkness. The door slowly swung inward, revealing nothing. I turned on the light, trembling, but my room was empty. I barely slept after that. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up my essentials and crashed at a friend's place, determined to break whatever curse I seemed to have stumbled into. I didn't tell her about the mannequin or the studio. I didn't want to sound crazy. After a week at her place, things seemed to settle. The knocking stopped, and nothing strange happened. I started to think maybe I had left whatever was haunting me behind in that studio. Until one night, when I returned to her apartment after work. Her place was small, and she always kept the front window blinds open for light. From the street below, I could see the living room, lit and empty, except for a figure standing in the corner. The mannequin, its angular body was silhouetted against the light, perfectly still, facing the window. I froze, the grocery bags in my hands falling to the pavement. When I looked again, it was gone. I never went back inside. I called my friend from the street and told her to leave immediately. She thought I was insane, but thankfully she she listened. She never saw the mannequin, and to this day, she insists I must have imagined it. But I knew what I saw. I moved far away after that, to a new city in a new state, and I've been careful never to work late or stay anywhere alone. It's been months now, and I haven't seen it since. But sometimes, late at night, I feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, as though something is watching me. Life slowly began to settle after I moved. I chose a place in a bustling city where the noise and activity gave me a sense of safety. My new apartment was small but cozy, perched on the 6th floor of a well-maintained building. I avoided working late nights, spent more time around people, and made an effort to stay grounded. I convinced myself that whatever the mannequin was, if it was even real, it wouldn't find me here. For months, things were normal, peaceful, even until the package arrived. It was a plain brown box with no return address. At first, I thought it was something I'd ordered and forgotten about. The handwriting on the label was neat but unfamiliar. The delivery had been left on my doorstep, and curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a single item, an old, cracked mirror. The glass was cloudy, and the frame looked handmade, roughly carved wood with faded paint that might have once been white. As I pulled it from the box, I noticed something strange. The glass wasn't reflecting properly. My face appeared distorted, stretched in odd angles, like a funhouse mirror. Unease crept over me as I realized the mirror's surface felt unnaturally cold, even in my warm apartment. I decided not to keep it. I wrapped it back up, placed it in the hallway outside my apartment, and planned to drop it off at a donation center the next day. That night, I barely slept, haunted by the feeling that something wasn't right. When I opened my door the next morning, the box was gone. For a moment, I felt relief, maybe someone had taken it, but then I turned back into my apartment and froze. The mirror was sitting on my kitchen table. I knew I hadn't brought it back inside. The door had been locked, and there were no signs of a break-in. My stomach churned as I realized the mirror wasn't just back, it looked different. The cracks in the glass seemed more pronounced, forming jagged lines that almost resembled a face. I threw the mirror out that day. I didn't care where it ended up as long as it was out of my home. I left it in a dumpster several blocks away and returned to my apartment, feeling a mix of triumph and paranoia. But that night, I woke up to a sound that made my blood freeze, a faint tapping coming from my closet. My heart raced as I reached for my phone, its light barely illuminating the room. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. I wanted to believe it was something mundane, a pipe perhaps, but deep down, I knew better. Summoning every ounce of courage, I crept to the closet and threw the door open. It was empty. No mirror, no mannequins, nothing. The tapping stopped instantly, leaving me in silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, sitting with every light in the apartment turned on. The next day, I called a locksmith and had the locks changed. I considered moving again, but decided to wait, hoping it was just my imagination. A week passed without incident. Then, one evening, as I was coming home from work, I stopped dead in my tracks. Sitting in front of my apartment door was the mirror, its frame cracked in places that hadn't been there before. The distorted, almost human shape in the glass was clearer now, and as I stared, I thought I saw it move. I'm writing this now from a motel room across town. I've left my apartment for good, breaking the lease and abandoning everything I owned. It doesn't feel like enough. I don't think it matters where I go. Whatever this is, it's found me. I can't escape it. I used to live in a big city known for its sprawling urban skyline. My apartment was on the 14th floor of a towery residential complex. From my living room window, I could see a neighboring building's flat rooftop. It was one of those older buildings with a large, empty expanse of tar paper and gravel, dotted with rusty ventilation fans and a long dormant water tower. One summer evening, during one of those humid, restless nights, I was sitting by my window, sipping on a cold drink and enjoying the faint breeze. The rooftop was dark except for a single, flickering light. It wasn't unusual. Sometimes maintenance crews would leave work lights out. I didn't think much of it until the light moved. It wasn't a steady movement like someone walking with a flashlight. It wobbled like a lantern swaying in the wind. I squinted at the distance, trying to make out more details, but the light wasn't bright enough to illuminate anything around it. Just as I was about to dismiss it as nothing, a shape passed through the light. It was faint, almost translucent, but definitely there. It was tall and gangly, with impossibly long arms and a slight hunch to its back. The lantern dangled from one of its hands, or what I assumed was a hand. It paused mid-step, turning as though it was looking straight at me. I froze. I knew it couldn't really see me, not from that distance. My apartment was dark, and I was behind thick glass. Still, the way it lingered felt deliberate, as though it had sensed something. Suddenly, the light disappeared, plunging the rooftop back into darkness. For a moment, I thought it had gone, but then I noticed movement again, a faint shadow darting across the rooftop, impossibly fast and fluid. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. My rational brain told me to calm calm down that it was just a trick of the light or maybe a bird flying across the roof, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, I told myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Still, I couldn't resist looking out the window at the rooftop. It was empty as I'd expected, no light, no strange shadows, just the same worn gravel and tar paper. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Near the edge of the rooftop, directly across from my window, was a pile of stones arranged in a perfect circle. I hadn't seen that the night before. That night, I closed my blinds. I haven't opened them since. For a while after that, I tried to push the incident out of my mind. I didn't mention it to anyone who would believe me. A lantern carrying shadow on a rooftop. It sounded ridiculous even to me. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. A few nights later, I was getting ready for bed when I heard a faint tapping sound. It wasn't coming from the door, but from the window. My blood ran cold. I hadn't opened the blind since that night. Slowly, I crept toward the window, holding my breath. The tapping grew louder and more deliberate, like someone gently knocking with a fingernail. I stood there, frozen, staring at the closed blinds. My phone was on the counter, out of reach. I wanted to pull the cord and look, to prove to myself it was nothing, just a branch blowing in the wind, or maybe a bird. But deep down, I knew better. I backed away, step by step, until I was in the hallway. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It stretched on for what felt like hours, and just as I was about to convince myself it was all in my head, I heard something new, a faint scratching, like nails dragging across glass. This time, I grabbed my phone and ran to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I stayed there for the rest of the night, the lights on, scrolling mindlessly through social media to distract myself. I didn't sleep a wink. When dawn finally broke, I emerged cautiously. The apartment was quiet, the blinds undisturbed. I convinced myself it was over, whatever it was. But my relief was short-lived. That evening, as the sun set, I noticed something out of place. On my balcony table sat a small, rusted lantern. I hadn't placed it there. I didn't even own a lantern. It looked old, the kind you'd see in a historical reenactment or an antique store. Its glass was cracked, and inside was a melted down candle that had long since burned out. I didn't touch it. I didn't even go out on the balcony. I just stared at it, heart pounding, trying to piece together how it had gotten there. My building was high security. No one could have climbed up to my balcony. No one had access but me. That night, I slept with all the lights on and my phone clutched in my hand. The lantern remained on the balcony, a silent reminder of whatever I had seen, or whatever had seen me. The next morning, it was gone. I moved out a month later. The lease was almost up anyway, and I couldn't stand being in that apartment any longer. To this day, I don't know what happened. I never saw the lantern or the shadow again, but I still think about that rooftop. Was it a warning, a message, or just a random encounter with something I'll never understand? Moving out helped, but only slightly. Even after I settled into a new apartment miles away from the old one, the experience lingered. Every time I walked past a window at night, I'd catch myself glancing outside, half expecting to see that flickering lantern. Rationally, I knew it couldn't have followed me, but irrational fears don't care about logic. About 3 months after I moved, I received an unmarked envelope in the mail. It wasn't unusual. I'd been updating my address on accounts and utilities, so I assumed it was some leftover paperwork. But when I opened it, my stomach dropped. Inside was a single Polaroid photo. It showed the rooftop of my old building. The photo wasn't well framed. It was slightly tilted and grainy, as though it had been taken quickly, but I could see the circle of stones, now surrounded by strange symbols scrawled in white chalk. I didn't recognize the symbols, but they had an eerie, purposeful look, like something out of a ritual. My first instinct was to throw the photo away, but I couldn't stop staring at it. There, near the edge of the rooftop, was a faint shape. It was blurry, almost transparent, but it was there, the same gangly, hunched figure I had seen that first night. The lantern it held was glowing faintly in the dim light of the photo. I flipped the Polaroid over, hoping for some kind of explanation. Instead, there were just 3 words scrawled in shaky handwriting. Still watching, careful. I dropped the photo like it was on fire. My hand shook as I stared at it lying on the table, the words practically burning into my brain. Who had sent this? How did they know where I lived? More importantly, what did they mean by careful? I called the police. They took the photo and the envelope, promising to look into it, but I could tell from the way they talked that they thought it was just a prank. Maybe it was. That would have been the best case scenario, but deep down, I didn't believe it. For weeks, nothing happened. I almost convinced myself that the whole ordeal was over. Then, one night, I woke up to a soft, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from the window this time. It was coming from my closet. The tapping was faint, almost tentative, like someone was gently knocking from inside. My heart felt like like it was going to explode. I reached for my phone with shaking hands and turned on the flashlight. Slowly, I got out of bed and crossed the room, every step feeling like it took hours. I opened the closet door in one quick motion, bracing for something, anything, but it was empty, just my clothes and a few boxes. I shone the flashlight around, my breathing ragged, nothing, but then I noticed it, a faint, lingering smell like burnt wax and metal. My blood ran cold. It smelled exactly like an old, extinguished lantern. I didn't sleep that night, and the next morning, I called a movie company. I didn't care how ridiculous it looked. I packed up and left that same day. I didn't tell my landlord why, and I didn't care about breaking the lease. I just wanted out. Now, years later, I still don't know what that thing was or why it fixated on me. I've moved twice since then, never staying in one place for too long. I keep my windows covered, my doors locked, and my phone within arm's reach at all times. This happened to be last summer when I worked part-time at a small community pool. The pool wasn't much, just a couple of lanes for laps, a shallow kiddie section, and a tiny concession stand that sold overpriced nachos and soda. But the place had a reputation for being haunted. The older lifeguards would joke about it, claiming to hear voices echoing when the pool was empty or seeing ripples in the water at night. I didn't believe them, at least not until the fourth stall incident. The locker rooms were pretty run down. There were 3 showers and 4 stalls in the women's bathroom. Everyone avoided the fourth stall because the lock was broken and the door always swung open on its own. It was this rusty, creaky thing that never fully shut, no matter how much you fiddled with it. One day, I was on closing duty. That meant making sure the locker rooms were cleaned, the trash was taken out, and everything was locked up. It was around 9:30 p.m. and I was the last person in the building. I was sweeping up the women's locker room when I noticed the door to the fourth stall was shut. Fully shut. This struck me as odd because I had just been in there 5 minutes earlier and the door had been wide open as usual. Hello, I called, thinking maybe one of the lifeguards had come back to grab something they forgot. No answer. I knocked lightly on the stall door. Still no response. Feeling a little uneasy, I crouched down to see if there were any feet underneath. There weren't. At this point, I was starting to feel creeped out. I tapped the door with my broom handle and it creaked open slow and loud. The stall was empty, of course, but the air inside felt wrong. It was cooler than the rest of the room and had this faint, metallic smell like old pennies. I told myself I was imagining things, quickly finished sweeping, and got out of there. The next day, I mentioned it to one of the older lifeguards, Sarah. Her face went pale. Wait, you don't know about the fourth stall? She asked. No what? Apparently, a few years back, a girl drowned in the pool during a birthday party. No one noticed right away because the party was so chaotic. They found her too late, and she didn't make it. Her friends had said she went to the locker room just before it happened to use the bathroom. Specifically, the fourth stall. I tried to laugh it off, but Sarah was dead serious. We don't talk about it because her parents still come here sometimes, she said, but weird stuff happens. I'm telling you. After that, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I avoided the fourth stall as much as possible, even during cleaning. But about a week later, I was closing up again when I heard it, a faint knocking sound coming from the locker room. When I went inside, I saw the door to the fourth stall swinging back and forth, like someone had just pushed it. I froze, broom in hand. For a split second, I thought I heard a giggle, not loud, but light and far away, like it was coming from the air itself. I didn't finish cleaning that night. I locked up and ran to my car as fast as I could. After quitting, I tried to move on. I got a new job at a bookstore, something quieter, with no creepy locker rooms or haunted stalls. For a while, things seemed fine. The memories of the fourth stall faded into the background, almost like a bad dream. But then something happened that made me question if I had really left it behind. One night, I was closing up at the bookstore. It was late, around 10 p.m., and the store was dead silent. I was shelving some returns in the back corner when I heard it, the same faint, rhythmic knocking sound. My heart stopped. At first, I thought it was the heating system or maybe something outside, but as I stood there, holding my breath, I realized it was coming from the restroom area at the back of the store. I hadn't been back there all night. Against my better judgment, I went to investigate. The restroom door was propped open, as it always was after closing. The sound was louder now, unmistakable. I stepped inside and saw the stall door at the far end, fourth in a row, slowly swinging back and forth. Just like at the pool. Nope, I whispered to myself, backing out, but before I could turn around, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. I bolted out of the restroom, heart hammering, and called my manager to tell him I was locking up early. When I got home that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept telling myself it was a coincidence, that I was just paranoid because of what happened at the pool. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The knocking started at my apartment a week later. It was faint at first, barely audible, but always in sets of 4. Sometimes it came from my closet, other times from the bathroom bathroom. One night, I even heard it from under my bed. No matter how loud I turned up the TV or how much I distracted myself, it always came back. I tried telling myself it was all in my head, that I was imagining things. But then, one night, I woke up to the sound of giggling, soft, airy, and far too close. My bedroom door, which I always kept shut, was wide open, and on the floor, just inside the doorway, was a faint, wet footprint. That was the final straw. I packed a bag and left that apartment the next day, staying with a friend for a while. Eventually, I moved to a new city entirely, desperate to escape whatever had attached itself to me. It's been a year now, and for the most part, things have been quiet. But every so often, I'll hear a faint knock, 4 beats, soft and rhythmic. I'll tell myself it's just a creaky pipe or a noisy neighbor. But deep down, I know it's not. Moving to a new city brought me some peace, at least for a while. I avoided public restrooms, locker rooms, or anywhere with multiple stalls. Even at home, I started leaving doors open, closet doors, bathroom doors, just so I wouldn't have to deal with them closing on their own. It helped calm my nerves, but the fear never fully went away. One night, I was out with a small group of coworkers. We'd gone to a bar near work to celebrate someone's promotion. It was loud, crowded, and bright, the perfect kind of place to keep my mind off everything. But then, I made a mistake. After 2 drinks, I needed to use the restroom. It was a single occupancy one, nothing like the rows of stalls that haunted me before. I told myself it was fine, that I was overreacting. I pushed open the door, locked it behind me, and tried to focus on calming my nerves. As I washed my hands, I noticed something strange. The mirror above the sink was old and spotted, like it hadn't been cleaned in years. But in the corner of the glass, just at the edge of the reflection, I saw movement. I froze. There was no one else in the restroom. I'd locked the door behind me. Slowly, I turned my head to look behind me, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the movement was gone. Then I heard it, faint and muffled but unmistakable, the sound of knocking. 4 soft taps, coming from the other side of the wall. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just noise from the crowded bar. But as I dried my hands and reached for the door, I heard the giggle, light and airy, like a child trying to stifle a laugh. I didn't look back. I yanked the door open and bolted out of the restroom, not caring who saw me. My coworkers stared as I rushed back to the table, pale and shaking. Someone asked if I was okay, but I just nodded and said I wasn't feeling well. When I got home that night, I checked every lock, every window, and every corner of my apartment. Nothing seemed out of place, but the sense of dread wouldn't go away. I stayed up all night, every creak and groan of the building setting my nerves on edge. The next day, I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I needed answers. I contacted Sarah, the lifeguard from the pool, hoping she might know something more. She was surprised to hear from me, but when I explained everything, she hesitated before speaking. "You need to talk to someone," she said, "someone who knows how to deal with this kind of thing." I wasn't sure what she meant until she gave me the number of a woman who claimed to be a medium. I was skeptical, but desperation has a way of changing your perspective. The medium, an older woman named Diane, came to my apartment a few days later. She walked through the room slowly, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she reached the bathroom, she stopped. "You've been marked," she said softly. "Marked?" I asked, my stomach twisting. It's not uncommon when spirits attach themselves to people. They're drawn to fear, to unresolved energy. But this one is different. It's playful, but it's not harmless. I felt my knees go weak. What do I do? Diane gave me a long look before answering. "You need to confront it, acknowledge it, tell it that it doesn't have power over you. But be firm. Spirits like this thrive on attention, and the more you feed it, the stronger it becomes." The thought of confronting whatever this was terrified me, but I didn't see another option. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, every light on, and said aloud, "I know you're here. I don't know what you want, but you're not welcome. You don't belong here, and I'm not afraid of you." The knocking stopped after that. The apartment felt lighter, and for the first time in months, I slept through the night. I was helping a professor digitize a collection of rare manuscripts for a research project. The building housing the manuscripts was old, tucked away at the farthest corner of the campus. It was the kind of place that even students seemed to avoid: creaky wooden floors, dim lighting, and a musty smell that clung to the walls. The professor showed me the ropes on my first day, and then I was left to work on my own for the rest of the week. My job was straightforward: scan, catalog, and upload the files. The room I worked in was on the 3rd floor, a long, narrow space lined with shelves of books and boxes that probably hadn't been touched in decades. On the second day, I noticed something odd. Every time I left the room to use the restroom or grab coffee, one of the chairs would be slightly moved when I returned. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The shifts were subtle, a chair angled differently or pulled just a bit away from the table. By the 3rd day, it was undeniable. I decided to test it. Before leaving for lunch, I placed a stack of books on the seat of the chair and took a photo with my phone. When I returned, the books were still there, but the chair had been pushed all the way under the table. I asked the professor about it, trying to sound casual. He laughed and said, "Oh, that's just the custodian. He's been here forever. Quiet guy, keeps to himself." That night, I stayed late to finish a batch of manuscripts. Around 9 p.m., the building was silent except for the faint hum of the scanner. I heard a creak behind me and turned, expecting to see the custodian. The aisle was empty. I brushed it off and kept working, but the feeling of being watched crept in. The overhead lights flickered, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I decided I'd had enough and packed up to leave. As I locked the door to the room, I glanced down the hall and froze. At the end of the corridor, just beyond the reach of the dim light, stood a figure. They were motionless, their silhouette barely distinguishable. "Hello," I called, my voice echoing in the empty building. No response. I didn't stick around to investigate. I practically ran down the stairs and out into the cold night air. The next morning, I mentioned the incident to the professor. His face turned serious. "There's no custodian on staff," he said slowly. I insisted that someone had been moving the chair, and I described the figure in the hall. He shook his head. "You're the only one with access to that floor." After my experience, I tried to push the incident to the back of my mind. I told myself it was just exhaustion and overthinking from working late in a creepy old building. But the encounter nagged at me, the details refusing to fade. About a week later, I got a package in the mail. It was from the university professor. Inside was a small envelope and a letter. The letter read, "Thank you for your help with the manuscripts. I thought you might find this interesting. I was reviewing the digitized files and found a note tucked inside one of the books you scanned. It doesn't appear to match the age or context of the manuscripts. I'd appreciate your thoughts." Curious, I opened the envelope. The note inside was written on old, yellow paper in shaky, spidery handwriting. It said, "You should be here. Leave before he notices you." My stomach dropped. I recognized the book the note had come from. It was one of the last ones I worked on before leaving that night. I hadn't noticed anything strange about it at the time, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that the warning was meant for me. I immediately called the professor. He sounded uneasy when he answered, and I could hear the slight tremor in his voice as he said, "There's something else. Since you left, I've been working in the archive alone, and I've started noticing things." He described the same phenomena I had experienced: the moved chairs, the flickery lights, the feeling of being watched. Then he added something new. "Last night, I heard footsteps on the 3rd floor. They were slow, deliberate. I thought maybe it was you or someone from the staff, but when I went to check, the hall was empty." The footsteps continued, though, right above me, moving back and forth, like they were pacing. I didn't know what to say. The idea of someone, or something, still moving through that building made my skin crawl. "Have you told anyone else?" I asked. I brought it up to one of the admin staff. He said, "She told me the building was supposed to be decommissioned decades ago, but they kept it open because of the archive." She also said, "There were rumors about a staff member who disappeared there years ago, a custodian who was said to know every inch of the building but was never found." That was enough for me. I told the professor I wanted nothing more to do with the project, and he didn't try to convince me otherwise. He said he'd wrap it up and suggested I focus on other work. I haven't heard from him since. Months went by and life returned to normal, or at least I told myself it had. I avoided thinking about the archive, the note, and the figure, but some part of me was still unsettled, like I was waiting for something to resurface. It wasn't until 6 months later that I finally heard from the professor again. It was an email, brief and cryptic. "I think you should know what I found. I'm not sure what to do with it, but I believe you deserve to see it. Please don't ignore this." Attached was a single file. It was a low-resolution video, dated 2 weeks after I had left the project. I hesitated before opening it. The memory of that building and its oppressive silence still clung to me, but curiosity won out. The video began with shaky footage of the archive's 3rd floor hallway, the same one I had seen the figure standing in that night. The professor's voice came over the audio, unsteady and low. I set up a motion-activated camera to catch whatever's been happening. He said, "This was recorded last night. At first, the hallway was still and silent, lit only by the dim overhead lights. A few seconds passed, and then the camera caught it, a chair sitting at one of the desks sliding out on its own. The movement was slow but deliberate. The chair stopped as though someone had sat down. Then, nothing. The video cut to another clip, timestamped just an hour later. This time, the motion sensor had picked up a shadow at the far end of the hall. It wasn't a person. It was amorphous, dark, and shifting, like smoke curling in the air. It lingered for several seconds before dissipating into the wall. The final clip was the most disturbing. It showed the professor himself walking down the hall, presumably to check the camera. As he moved, the shadow reappeared behind him. It didn't follow him, though. It stood there, stretching unnaturally tall, as though watching him leave. The video ended abruptly. I stared at the screen, heart racing. I emailed the professor back immediately, asking if he was okay, but my message bounced back. His university email was no longer active. Concerned, I tried calling the department, but the receptionist said the professor had taken an extended leave of absence. She didn't know when or if he'd return. I don't know what happened to him after that. that, a part of me doesn't want to know. All I do know is that whatever is in that building isn't a custodian, and it isn't bound by the usual rules of this world. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about the shadow and its silent, watchful presence. And sometimes, I wonder if leaving that project was enough to escape its notice, or if I might someday find a chair moved in my own home, or a shadow where one should it be. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.